And without objection, the chair is authorized to declare recess at any time. Before I deliver my opening remarks, I want to note that committee is meeting virtually, and I want to announce a couple of reminders to the members about the conduct of the hearing. First, members should keep their video feed on as long as they're present in the meeting. Members are responsible for their own microphones. And without objection, please also keep your microphones muted at any time unless you are speaking. And finally, if members have documents they wish to submit for the record, please email them to the committee clerk, whose email address was circulated prior to the meeting. These are our standard instructions, and I know we'll all cooperate. Just a month ago on Valentine's Day, Winter Storm Uri descended upon Texas and broke cold temperature records across the state. 48% of the electricity generation capacity for the state grid went offline due to frozen components and frozen fuel supplies. By February the 16th, 4 million Texas households were without power. Millions of Texans had no heat and no electricity for 3 days or more, with temperatures well below freezing. At least 70 people died as a result of Winter Storm Uri and these power outages. One of them was just 11 years old. Princeton died of hypothermia after electricity was cut off in his family's mobile home in Conroe, Texas. He'd been trying to stay warm under a pile of blankets with his 3-year-old brother. An 8-year-old girl and her mother died of carbon monoxide poisoning in Harris County after they ran the family car to try to stay warm. The electricity and heating crisis led to a severe water crisis. Water pipes burst, flooding homes. By Friday the 19th, 12 million Texans were under a boil water advisory because the water supplies had fallen too low. And all of this happened in the midst of the greatest public health crisis this country has seen in a century. When families are dealing with lost loved ones, lost jobs, illness, and isolation. I'm lucky enough to have lost power for just one day, and I kept warm overnight just by piling on blankets. Texans deserve better. There was a lot of discussion in the immediate aftermath of the Texas blackouts about who to blame. There was a lot of misinformation and political jockeying. What seems clear already is that Electric Reliability Council of Texas, better known as ERCOT, failed to prepare its energy infrastructure for extreme weather conditions. It is unacceptable that millions of Texans were left without power for days on end during one of the worst winter storms in our state's history. But I know there's more for us to examine about what happened in Texas, and it is our responsibility as policymakers to get answers. Why didn't the models used by the utilities see this coming? Which systems and components performed well and which failed? Could better demand response technologies have allowed the Texas grid operators to ease the burden of these charges and outages? What was the role of climate change in enabling the conditions for this extreme weather episode? How ready is the electric uh, sector for future extreme weather events like wildfires and heat waves? That's what I had thought we'd be looking forward to, but not this type of winter. Will Texas be brought to its knees if our grid is attacked by a sophisticated adversary? If we can get a clear eyed understanding of how these failures occurred, we can help prevent them from happening in the future. What Texans endured last month must not be in vain. We must learn from this episode and redouble our research efforts in support of a more reliable, resilient electricity sector. Last Congress, our fellow committee member, Mr. Bear of California, introduced a bipartisan bill with Mr. Weber of Texas to do just that, called the Grid Security Research and Development Act. I understand he intends to reintroduce this bill this Congress, and I look forward to working with him and my other colleagues on both sides of the aisle for this important effort. Today, I look forward to the testimony of our witnesses, some of whom were also personally affected by power outages. These five panelists represent some of the foremost experts in electricity reliability in the country, and we are honored to have them with us today. I hope that as the Texas legislature considers what to do in response to this crisis, they will heed the lessons that we all share with us today. I now recognize and yield to our ranking member, Mr. Lucas.
Thank you, Chairwoman Johnson, for holding this important and timely hearing. Today, we have an opportunity to examine last month's blackouts in Texas and other southern and Midwestern states. There is no better time to hear about the ongoing efforts by industry, federal agencies, and the Department of Energy national labs to learn from these events and adopt for the future. Before we begin, I'd like to express my gratitude for the safety of my Texas friends here, and I hope your families are well and your districts, like mine, are on their way to recovery. I'd also like to commend the public utilities and member-owned cooperatives in my state for how well they manage their crisis and ensure the safety of their customers and my constituents. Physical and cyber threats to our power grid are constantly evolving. This incident, alongside last year's wildfires on the West Coast and the recent SolarWinds cyber attack, highlights the need for congressional action to ensure the security and resilience of the U.S. energy sector. As we discuss these events and their causes, we on the Science Committee have a responsibility to focus on the long-term technological solutions that can help us prepare for and respond to the next trial. As the past year has shown, it's not a matter of if our grid will be tested again, it's a matter of when. The Science Committee has jurisdiction over DOE's electricity delivery, cybersecurity, energy security, and emergency response research and development activities. This work is essential to maintaining the stability and flexibility of our grid, not just for today's needs, but also for the next generations. So it's through its world-leading national laboratories and Grid Modernization Laboratory Consortium, DOE supports R&D in advanced grid modeling, grid energy storage, information sharing, and advanced control systems. By partnering with industry, DOE can provide stakeholders with critical expertise and enable the deployment of new grid security tools and technologies. This morning, we will hear from Beth Garza, a senior fellow with R Street's Energy and Environmental Policy team. She served as the director of the Electric Reliability Council of Texas, known to all of us as ERCOT, independent marketing monitor from 2014 through 2019. Beth brings a critical perspective to this distinguished witness panel and could provide firsthand insight into ERCOT and the power supply industry as a whole. I look forward to her testimony highlighting the needs and challenges of our diverse and complex power delivery system. This hearing also will serve as an opportunity to discuss grid security legislation. Last year, H.R. 5760, the Grid Security Research and Development Act, passed by the House with strong bipartisan support. This legislation authorizes DOE research, development, and demonstration activities that focus on the discovery of innovative tools and technologies for energy sector security and resilience. The provisions of this bill were originally a central component of the bipartisan and bicameral Energy Act of 2020, which became law last Congress. Unfortunately, due to last-minute jurisdictional claims from outside committees, this bill had to be removed from the Energy Act at the 11th hour. I am hopeful that we can work together to once again introduce and pass grid security legislation this session, preferably this year. The energy sector faces unique challenges that require institutional knowledge and data that only the Department of Energy can provide. DOE is responsible for energy critical infrastructure, which includes electric power, oil and natural gas. It also has authority over the cybersecurity of energy delivery systems. Providing DOE researchers and industry with the tools they need to ensure the long-term security and resilience of our electric grid should be something we can all agree on. This Congress, I will prioritize getting these provisions over the finish line, working with my friends on both sides of the aisle to get this done. I thank our witnesses today for their valuable testimony at such a critical time, and I look forward to a productive discussion about how federal agencies can work with industry to deliver affordable power to American homes, businesses, and essential services. Thank you, Madam Chair, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Lucas. And at this time, if there are persons who would wish to submit a statement for the record, you're welcome to do that. I'd like now to introduce our witnesses. Dr. Jesse Jenkins is an assistant professor at Princeton University with a joint appointment in the Department of Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering and the Andlinger Center for Energy and Environment. Dr. Jenkins also leads the Princeton Zero Lab, the Zero Carbon Energy Systems Research and Optimization Laboratory. He earns his PhD in Engineering Systems and a Master's in Technology and Policy from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Dr. Varun Ray is the Walt and the Espath Rostow Professor in the LBJ School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas at Austin. He is the director of the UT Energy Institute and Associate Dean for Research in the LBJ School. He received his PhD and his Master's in Mechanical Engineering from Stanford University and a bachelor's degree in Mechanical Engineering from Indian Institute of Technology. Dr. Juan Torres is the Associate Laboratory Director of Energy Systems Integration at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. In this role, he oversees NOREL's research to modernize and strengthen the security, resilience, and sustainability of the nation's electrical grid. Prior to his time at NREL, he had a 27-year career at Sandia National Laboratories. Mr. Torres holds a bachelor's degree in electronic engineering technology from the University of Southern Colorado, a master's degree in electrical engineering from the University of New Mexico. Ms. Beth Garza is a senior fellow with R Street's Energy and Environmental Policy team. Ms. Garza previously served as the director of Electric Liability Council of Texas, independent market monitor from 2014 through 2019, after serving as a deputy director since 2008. She is a graduate of the University of Missouri and a registered professional engineer in the state of Texas. Last but certainly not least, Dr. Sue Tierney is a senior advisor at Analyst Group, an economic consulting firm located in Boston. She is a former Assistant Secretary for Policy at the U.S. Department of Energy, State Cabinet Officer for Environmental Affairs, and State Public Utility Commissioner, and has more than 35 years of experience in this field. a master's degree and PhD in regional planning are from Cornell University. I want to thank all of our outstanding witnesses for joining us today. And as our witnesses should know, you will have 5 minutes for your spoken testimony. Your written testimony will be included in the record for the hearing. When you have completed your spoken testimony, we will begin our questions. Each member will have 5 minutes to question you as a panel. Now we will start with Dr. Jenkins. Dr. Jenkins, you may begin your testimony.
Thank you and good morning. My name is Jesse Jenkins, and I must note that the views expressed in this testimony are my own, and I am not speaking as a representative of Princeton University. I'd like to first thank Chair Johnson and Ranking Member Lucas and the members of this committee for inviting my testimony. And I commend the committee for holding this hearing and for trying to get to the bottom of what went wrong in Texas during last month's extreme cold. The truth is there's plenty of blame to go around. The failures to plan for and build resilience to this extreme cold were systemic. All sources of power experienced failures, from natural gas and coal plants to wind turbines and even one of the state's 4 nuclear reactors. The energy crisis was not limited just to the power system. Natural gas wells and pipelines also froze, cutting off gas supply just as it was needed most. And state and federal policymakers alike all failed to require more robust winterization measures after a 2011 storm provided ample warning of the fragility of Texas's energy infrastructure to extreme cold. These systemic failures make it easy to cherry-pick claims that advance one's preferred narrative. But the dozens of Texans who died and the millions who suffered through the crisis deserve a full account of what went wrong. And now is the time to learn from the crisis and to take steps to prepare for the extreme weather that all Americans face, threats that climate change is making more severe. Energy systems can and should be made more resilient with existing technology. After all, wind turbines operate today in Antarctica, gas plants in Alberta, and gas wells in Alaska. Of course, weatherizing our infrastructure comes at an added cost that must be paid back every year in the hopes that devastating but rare crises are avoided. In this way, building resilience to extreme events is a bit like buying fire insurance for your home. Most of us buy insurance not because we ever expect our homes to burn, but we know that if such a tragedy should occur, we'd lose everything, and building our lives back may be impossible. So, we pay the premium every year. Determining how much insurance, in the form of investment in grid resilience, is worth it, and what kinds of crises we wish to protect against is thus the key question. Answering this question is more difficult now than ever because the changing climate means the past is no longer a safe guide to the future. Extreme weather events are dangerous because our critical infrastructures are resilient only up to a point. When pushed a little bit further, a few degrees colder or hotter, an inch more rain, these systems can fail in catastrophic ways. This is where research can make a difference. Expanded investment in climate science could help planners build more resilient systems. This research should focus on assessing impacts on critical infrastructures and identifying catastrophic failure modes. We must also look forward to the technologies needed to build a resilient, affordable, and clean electricity system. We can see a glimpse of this future in Texas, where wind and solar provide a quarter of all electricity in 2020, more than 2.5 times the national average. Yet during this crisis, wind and solar provided at times a tiny fraction of their maximum output, leading some to question, can we assure a clean and resilient grid with a larger role for wind and solar power? The answer is yes, and to understand why, we need to understand the role of each resource in our electricity system. We don't need every source of electricity to be reliable at all times. What we need is the system to be reliable, and that requires a mix of electricity resources all playing the right role. Wind and solar don't deliver value by being dependable. Everyone knows the wind is inconstant and the night affects solar output. Wind and solar deliver real value as fuel-saving resources. When available, these resources displace costlier sources of electricity from fuel-consuming resources like natural gas and coal. That saves billions of dollars and helps reduce carbon dioxide emissions. What we also need is to maintain sufficient firm generating capacity to deliver necessary reliability. Firm resources are technologies that are available on demand any time of the year for as long as needed. These characteristics make firm resources a critical complement to weather-dependent renewable energy sources, as well as resources like batteries that are best suited to fast bursts of use rather than sustained output over several days or weeks. Princeton's Net Zero America study, which I co-authored, finds that the U.S. needs to maintain a similar magnitude of firm generating capacity as we have today, as the nation makes a big but affordable transition to net zero greenhouse gas emissions. Over the next decade, existing gas capacity and nuclear reactors can act as firm resources and ensure reliability as wind and solar expand and displace coal and gas-fired generation. But reaching 100% carbon-free electricity systems will ultimately require sufficient clean firm capacity. And the time to invest in these technologies is now. Wind, solar, lithium-ion batteries took decades to improve, including funding from R&D, demonstration, and creation of early market opportunities through subsidies and standards. This proven process of making clean energy cheap must now be replicated for a full portfolio of clean firm technologies. In the Energy Act of 2020, this committee worked on a bipartisan basis to enact critical new authorizations to advance many of these innovative clean firm technologies. More effort and investment will be required to scale up and improve these technologies in the years ahead, beginning with appropriations this year to make new authorizations a reality. Thank you for having me today, and I look forward to engaging with you on these critical questions.
Thank you, Dr. Jenkins. Dr. Varun Rai.
Thank you, Chair Johnson. Good morning, everyone. Good morning to Ranking Member Lucas and other members of the committee. My name is Varun Rai. I'm a professor at the University of Texas at Austin, and thank you for the opportunity to appear before you for this important hearing. I live in Austin, Texas. Texas-wide power outages started early morning of 15 February, affecting more than 4 million homes and businesses over 3 days. Inside our house, the temperature went down into the 30s for several days. It's living inside of a refrigerator for days. Sadly, some of my fellow Texans died due to the crisis and aren't around to tell their tales. There were 3 key contributors to the severity of the impact. First, equipment in both power generation and gas production systems froze. After another blackout in Texas in 2011, winterization of both power and gas equipment was identified as a high priority item. Some changes were made based on those recommendations, but no standards or requirements tied to operational performance in extreme cold were set. This has meant that there is insufficient overall investment in winterization of the energy system in Texas. Second, there are gaps in communication and coordination. As part of ERCOT's load shedding, power to many oil and gas field operations was shut down, which meant a further strain on gas production on top of declines in production due to the weather. Power was also lost at water treatment and pumping facilities across the state. On the customer side, there was an absolute lack of coordinated, consistent, and timely emergency communication to the people of Texas. This translated the extreme weather-induced stress on the power system into a severe humanitarian crisis. Third, even with clear warning of a severe weather event days and even weeks ahead, there are not enough calls in advance to reduce demand and conserve energy, including both electricity and gas. In my view, not mobilizing enough voluntary demand reduction during the weather event was the single biggest lost opportunity to minimize the impacts of the crisis. Looking ahead, to learn fully from the Texas power crisis of mid-February 2021, there are 5 questions that need further and immediate research to support decision-making. Over 4 million homes and businesses in Texas lost power during the crisis. Power outage led to a water crisis. The power and water failures put millions of Texans under extreme physical, mental, and financial stress. The load sheds were based on unsophisticated critical load lists, which did not account for infrastructure interdependency. Thus, we need research and to design load management strategies to minimize extreme stress for households, taking into account the interdependent nature of critical infrastructure and implications for fairness and equity. Some early estimates put the damages and economic losses upwards of $100 billion. The full scale and scope of costs and losses are multifaceted. For example, damages to water infrastructure and lost production at manufacturing facilities, and bankruptcies of companies and local utilities and local governments. We should consider all these factors when evaluating the benefits and costs of infrastructure investments. there is critical need to support research that advances a more robust and comprehensive accounting and understanding of the full scale of damages that result from extreme events. As I mentioned before, one of the biggest failures in the days leading up to the event was how poorly the demand side was engaged. Demand flexibility, both programmatic and voluntary, will inevitably need to play a much larger and effective role in the future to maintain system reliability in the face of extreme events. Achieving that flexibility at very large scale and over short timeframes of hours and days is an important area of further research. To outside observers, during much of the crisis, there was very little information and data about the status of the system and how it might evolve. People were not just in power darkness, they were also in information darkness. To address this, there is a need to design data sharing mechanisms and collaborative efforts, including researchers at universities and national labs, with appropriate data governance mechanisms to enable monitoring, analysis, feedback, and problem solving by the broader community around and during crises. With the frequency of extreme weather events expected to increase as impacts of climate change unfold further, the need to understand the long-term benefits and costs of connecting ERCOT to the US Eastern and Western grids is also immediate. In particular, we need research that accounts for climate-induced stresses on the energy system, system-wide vulnerabilities and options, changing energy mix, and changing nature of demand. Thank you again for the opportunity to present at this hearing, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Rao. Mr. Juan Torres.
Chairwoman Johnson, Ranking Member Lucas, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to discuss the reasons or insights we've gained from this event. I commend the committee for this timely hearing, as it will inform research to help guide the nation toward a more secure and resilient energy future. My name is Juan Torres, and I serve as the Associate Laboratory Director for Energy Systems Integration at the U.S. Department of Energy's National Renewable Energy Laboratory, or NREL, in Golden, Colorado. I've been affiliated with federal research in our national laboratory system for over 30 years. In my current position, I direct NREL's efforts to strengthen the security, resilience, and sustainability of our nation's electric grid. In addition, I'm co-chair for the DOE Grid Modernization Laboratory Consortium and technical lead for its security and resilience teams. I observed the catastrophic failures of the Texas energy system not just as a research engineer, but as a concerned parent, as both of my children reside in Texas. My son works in Austin, and my daughter is a graduate student in Irving. The severity of the event was clear when the conversations with them became, do you have enough food, water, and blankets? Sit in your car and run it to charge your phone and get warm. Tragically, many others in the Texas community had it much worse. It's been said that necessity is the mother of invention. I can say that we have many needs with regards to the power grid, but I'm also hopeful because we as a nation have the innovation horsepower to meet these needs. But where do we start? First, we need to understand where we came from and where we're going. There is no single owner, operator, or architect for the U.S. power system. It is an engineering marvel influenced by a collective of stakeholders over more than a century. Recent years have seen the grid evolve from a network based on large centralized generation to a hybrid system incorporating more distributed renewable resources. Significant changes are also occurring at the grid edge, near the consumer. Never before has the consumer been more proactive and engaged with the operation of the grid. Real-time pricing, transactive energy, smart appliances and lighting, grid interactive buildings and smart loads, electric vehicles, and residential photovoltaics are just some of the technologies transforming the edge of the grid. And we have yet to understand the long-term energy impacts and innovations resulting from COVID-19's influence on the work-from-home culture. Equally important is awareness of the dynamic threat space, which includes not only severe weather, but also physical attacks, geomagnetic disturbances, electromagnetic pulse events, and the ever-growing cyber threat. I offer the following recommendations based on critical lessons from the recent outage in Texas and other past major storm events. First, take actions to harden the grid and generation fleet to the broad spectrum of evolving threats through improved monitoring, planning, investments, and technology advancements. Second, address the overall resilience of the energy system from fuel to generation to delivery to end use, taking into account interdependent infrastructure such as communication systems, natural gas pipelines, and transportation systems. Third, research how a grid with more controllable devices and increasingly high penetrations of variable renewable generation can be even more secure and resilient than today's grid. While these challenges are considerable, research is lighting the path forward. Let me give you some examples. DOE's Grid Modernization Initiative and the 14 national labs in the Grid Modernization Laboratory Consortium have been working with industry and academia to tackle grid research challenges over the past 5 years in devices, advanced architectures and controls, design and planning tools, generation, sensors, regulatory and policy support, and security and resilience. NARM, the North American Energy Resilience Model, is a DOE multi-lab comprehensive modeling capability being developed to support grid planning and investment and to understand the grid's state of resilience while considering interdependencies with the natural gas and communication sectors. ARES, NREL's state-of-the-art advanced research on integrated energy systems platform, is leading the way for large-scale experimentation and cyber emulation of the future grid, from behind the meter to the bulk transmission system. We've only just opened the door to many new research directions. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today. I look forward to any questions you may have.
Thank you very much, Mr. Torres. Ms. Beth Garza.
Thank you. Good morning, Chairwoman Johnson, Ranking Member Lucas, and members of the committee. Before I get started, I want to add my recognition to the tremendous human impacts suffered by Texans during the February winter storms. I'm sure the efforts of this committee will help ensure that the U.S. infrastructure excuse me, becomes better able to withstand the challenges that it faces. Today, I'm going to discuss 3 areas where research would be of most value. These are forecasting, the weatherization or winterization of power plants and their fuel supply, and the third area is the improved granularity of operation and control of demand within the electricity distribution systems. So starting with forecasting, demand for electricity is very sensitive to weather conditions, primarily temperature. And as an industry, we've become very good at forecasting customer demand based on foreseeable weather conditions. However, if we'd had a better long-term view of potential weather conditions, system preparedness and resiliency would improve. ERCOT prepares and publishes an assessment of demand and supply for each season. Unfortunately, their forecast for extreme demand this past winter was based on weather experienced during February 2011. The weather conditions actually experienced this year were much more severe. I believe all electric utility systems would benefit from new forecasting tools and techniques to ensure their longer range planning is preparing them for the conditions that they may face. Moving on to the winterization of supply. I caution that it's too early to draw detailed conclusions about the causes of all of the generator outages that resulted in the curtailment of firm load. But based on preliminary data, it is clear that every type of generation, nuclear, coal, natural gas, wind, and solar, were limited in some manner during the extreme cold that we experienced. Also, based on preliminary data, generator outages were primarily the result of insufficient weatherization and fuel supply disruptions. I've heard that maybe half of the outages at natural gas plants, power plants, were due to the lack of fuel delivered at sufficient volumes and pressures. It's too early to draw specific conclusions other than to recognize the codependence of electricity and natural gas systems, especially in Texas. Much has been made of the lack of mandatory winterization standards for power plants. And I suggest that it's easy to say that winterization should be mandatory, but effective regulations require a specific standard to be met. And any such standard should also have benefits that exceed costs. And one of the challenges power plants and natural gas system owners in Texas face is appropriately assessing the winterization benefits due to the relative infrequency of very cold weather. Winterization comes in various forms with different costs and performance implications, and understanding these costs and performance trade-offs will be very valuable to the standard setting process. My last point has to do with distribution system improvements. Texas has an expansive advanced metering infrastructure, but preliminary results indicate that the Texas smart grid was not managed in a particularly smart manner. For example, the general manager of Austin Energy, my local public power utility, described our advanced meters as capable of being disconnected remotely, but requiring a person in the field to reconnect. The same topic came up during recent hearing at the Texas legislature, where an executive from CenterPoint Energy, which serves the greater Houston area, described different limitations preventing them from using their advanced meters to manage curtailments. The limitations, as I've heard them described, seem to be a lack of supplemental technologies combined with institutional and policy differences. The same improvements that could have eased the burden of these lengthy outages to a subset of customers could also form the foundation for demand to express their willingness to pay and receive higher reliability. The ability to use scarce supply to serve demand, which values it the most, is the foundation of economic efficiency. I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Garza. Dr. Sue Tierney.
Good morning, Chairwoman Johnson, Ranking Member Lucas, and members of the committee. My name is Sue Tierney. Although I am testifying today on my own behalf, I also share various grid resiliency and research-related recommendations from two recent National Academies of Sciences committees on which I have served. The recent power outages in Texas led to extremely challenging living conditions for millions of people, and of course, the tragedy of 70 people having lost their lives. It disrupted access to critical services like heating and water supply. This crisis highlights the critical role that reliable and resilient electric service plays in the health and well-being of Americans. It is clear that steps could have been taken by state officials, grid operators, and energy companies in Texas that would have lessened the extent of the crisis and these human hardships. These events cry out for the need for further research to ensure a resilient electric supply, especially as we anticipate worsening and more frequent extreme weather conditions in the decades ahead. The federal government has an essential role to play here. As the Academies of Sciences 2017 report on enhancing the resiliency of the electric grid pointed out, and I'm quoting here, the Department of Energy is the federal entity with a mission to focus on the longer-term issues of developing and promulgating technologies and strategies to increase the resilience and modernization of the grid. No other entity in the United States has the mission to support such work. This is a public good. If funding were not provided by the federal government, this gap in research won't be filled by the states or the private sector. In short, this is a role for the federal government. In my written testimony, I discussed factors that affected the power outages in Texas and related research needs. Because others on the panel have already talked about the Texas electricity crisis, I would only add a couple of points. Texas is the only state in the United States with an electric industry structure that combines an energy-only competitive wholesale market and mandatory customer choice among competitive retail suppliers. This is largely viewed by academic economists as having been a successful electricity market design, although some observers, including myself, have questioned whether such an approach that relies explicitly on the expectation of very high electricity prices at times of power shortages is politically sustainable in the event that such conditions actually occur. Now, for several years, the North American Electric Reliability Council has pointed out ERCOT's slim reserve margins as contributing to reliability risks. Texas previously experienced winter conditions which created electric reliability problems. And following up on investigations in 2011, the staff of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission and NERC said the outages could have been avoided, and they encouraged state policymakers to adopt policies to encourage performance of the system under stressful conditions. However, for the most part, policymakers and the electric and gas industries in Texas did not act on these recommendations. And this set the stage for the events in February this year. Clearly, these are a chilling reminder of the critical need for reliable and resilient electricity in our basic needs. Although the Texas electricity crisis was an unusual event, it could happen anywhere, and proactive steps should be taken to lower the risk and impacts of the occurrences. The 2017 Reliability and Resilience Report from the National Academies, along with a new report in February 2021 on the future of the power system, identified grid resilience as a key issue. In my written testimony, I have provided 7 pages of findings and recommendations from these 2 studies, and I won't go through them here. Let me just mention a very short set. First, we conclude that scientific research and applied development and demonstration programs related to the electric industry should be tripled. That's for science, and much more of this support should be in multi-year appropriations. I see my time is up, and I would encourage the committee to take a careful look at my written testimony for the additional recommendations. And I appreciate so much the committee's attention to these important issues. Thank you.
Thank you very much. At this point, we'll begin our first round of questions, and I will recognize myself for 5 minutes. Dr. Ryan, you pointed out that ERCOT's strategy for implementing load curtailment in order to keep demand and supply roughly even while generation supplies were out was basically all or nothing. Rather than users curtailing part of their electricity demand by lowering their thermostats, cutting some of their electricity use, entire sub-networks were either on or off. Is this how Houston got into the infuriating situation where people were freezing in their homes, and yet when they looked across the way at downtown, all the buildings were lit up and electrified with no one inside? And second question, how could a smarter load management strategy provide for more equity in grid operations during an emergency so that low-income neighborhoods don't take it all on the chin more than others? Dr. Ryan, could you enlighten us a bit?
Thank you so much for that question, Chairwoman Johnson. Your sense is right. The severity of the supply disruption was so high that in most parts of Texas, only critical load and critical circuits were kept alive. Everything, all the non-critical circuits, majority of them were shed. And that meant that the non-critical load that are part of the critical load circuits that were kept alive, they also stayed on. And there was not much ability, again, just because of the severity and the depth of the event, to rotate outages. And so that's linked very much to your second part of the question, Chairwoman Johnson, in terms of being able to rotate the outages and being fair and equitable about it. It did mean that there were several parts across Texas where lower income communities did have to weather a poor brunt of the whole event. And so as we heard from Ms. Garza, a much more granular approach to how these events are managed. The technologies do exist, but they do operate also in the underlying regulatory as well as operational context. And taking a holistic look at that is extremely important, but it is very possible, and it is one of the top priorities. It is one of the most low-hanging fruits there, Chairwoman.
Thank you very much. Dr. Jenkins, You spoke in your testimony about the evidence tells us that cause these blackouts. I'd like to ask just a quick yes or no answer. Um, Forbes published an op-ed in February 17th, which claimed that a renewably sourced energy captures a larger share of the power grid. Outages become inevitable. Is this true?
No, that's not true. If our systems maintain sufficient firm generation to complement wind and solar, we can maintain reliability and expand the role of wind and solar, lowering costs and lowering carbon dioxide emissions.
The Texas Public Policy Foundation published a statement on February the 16th, which claimed that fossil fuel electric generation didn't fail. Is that true?
That's not correct. We had over 30,000 megawatts of fossil generation capacity that was on forced outage during the crisis, making up the bulk of the total electricity shortfall during the blackouts. So natural gas power plants in particular were the largest absolute contributor to generation outages during the events.
Thank you. In the same statement, the Texas Public Policy Foundation claimed that blackouts never would have been an issue had our grid not been so deeply penetrated by renewable energy sources. Is that true?
That's not correct. There was sufficient firm generation capacity installed that if it had performed as intended, it would have supplied adequate supplies for the system. The Texas system operator plans on as little as 1,700 megawatts of contribution from wind and solar power during extreme winter events, such as the occurred in February. And so just a small fraction of what Texas was counting on to be there was wind and solar power. What Texans were counting on were natural gas and other firm power sources. And when those firm power sources fail, that's when widespread blackouts can occur.
Thank you very much. My time has expired. I'll now call on our ranking member, Mr. Lucas, for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My home district in Oklahoma was also impacted by last month's winter storms and grid interruptions. And while data is still being collected, one thing is clear. No single energy source, be it coal, wind, or natural gas, carries all the blame. Fact is, a diverse supply of affordable, reliable energy sources is essential to the success of our power delivery system. Ms. Garza, Mr. Torres, how will the adoption of new energy sources and hybrid energy systems affect how Congress and the federal government should be addressing grid security and resilience? And whichever one of you care to go first.
Well, you said my name first, so I guess I'll go first, Mr. Lucas. You said your comment was dead on. It is. We all benefit from I believe we all benefit from a wide variety of energy sources, and so with that, we have to recognize common causes of failure across all of those sources. But just having more and different types of generation should prove to be more reliable rather than relying all on one.
Mr. Torres?
Thank you for the question, Representative Lucas. What I see is that the evolution of renewables here, we're still at a state where we're not putting the same expectations on those renewables as what we have on some of the legacy baseload types of generation or other fossil generation. For example, I gave a testimony not long ago on Black Start. So putting those kinds of requirements so we can start to build that into some of the newer emerging technologies is really important. One of the other differences is as renewables are coming in to play a bigger part of our energy portfolio, they're not located as just centralized generation plants, but also as distributed resources. So now we can generate power, at near the loads, at homes and businesses, and that gives us different opportunities to use renewables for things like microgrids to provide some local resiliency for critical loads. So this is actually, the new technologies are giving us new opportunities and potential that we haven't had before with strictly centralized generation.
This Congress, I plan to reintroduce my bill, the Securing American Leadership in Science and Technology Act, which calls for the doubling of funding in DOE's Office of Science. Ms. Garza, what research is needed for technologies like advanced sensors and controls to assist the grid in emergency response?
So some of the challenges we face in terms of the outages and how those curtailments were managed, they're managed in a very blocky manner, if you will. And how that works is a device in a substation is open, cutting off electricity to hundreds, if not a couple of thousands of customers. And those actions are required to be taken very quickly, and that's how, you know, over the centuries, we've realized how to do it. But technology exists to allow those very fast actions, I believe exists to allow those very fast actions to occur at a more granular level. We don't need to take out a whole feeder at once, where along that feeder you could have some critical loads or some non-critical loads or some, you know, differing levels of reliability requirements for all of those customers. And by knowing that across your system, it seems like we could manage the reactions or the response in a much more granular and a much more targeted level than we're able to do now. And that, in my mind, requires software, sensors, you know, all the whiz-bang stuff that needs to exist to allow that to occur.
Mr. Torres, in the time I have remaining, how can fundamental research in areas like material science and advanced computing support this work, this effort?
I believe that there's opportunity to develop more inherently resilient materials that will comprise the grid of the future. So building resilience into the system from the ground up, making it an inherent element in how we operate and how we design our systems. There's opportunities with things like artificial intelligence to help us better assess with forecasting information, how to optimize operation of the grid. We can also utilize distributed computing to help us manage and operate the grid much differently than we do today, where we operate in a very, very centralized control architecture.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. And I will ask the clerk now to assist us in going to our members for questions.
Mr. Vera is next.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and to the ranking member for convening this hearing. Obviously very timely and incredibly important. I also, appreciate the ranking member's comments that, if we take the politics out of this, it's not, one type of electrical source versus another. It's what can we do to create redundancy here and redundant sources. And if we could remove the politics, we could let the science and entrepreneurial spirit of America address these issues. And far too often it's the politics that prevent us from recognizing that our climate is changing, that we're having more extreme events that are occurring similar to the winter snowstorm in Texas. But also in my home state of California, we see increasing wind events that have led to wildfires. They have now led to rolling blackouts when we see the wind starting to pick up. And that is unfortunately going to become more common, not less common. Part of the reason we have introduced in the last few Congresses the Grid Security Research and Development Act was we do have to make those investments in research in both the physical security of our electrical grid, but also the cyber risks that our electrical grid faces. And I'm pleased that the chairwoman and the ranking member, we passed it out of committee and we passed it out of the House twice last year. Did not quite get across the finish line, but we're going to reintroduce that act, which is bipartisan, and get that through the Senate and get that to the president's desk. And we think that would be a big first step. Maybe a question for Dr. Tierney. You talked about the Academy and some of the recommendations that the Academy was making in terms of research, but also security. Could you expand on some of those recommendations and, if we were to prioritize where we ought to focus, what your recommendations would be?
Thank you for that great question, Representative Bera. And speaking on behalf of myself, I think the bill that you plan to introduce is a very powerful tool to help with security and resilience of the grid in the face of cybersecurity events and other kinds of events as well. So the 2021 report called The Future of the Electric Grid included a number of recommendations regarding congressional authorization, appropriations, and DOE implementation of RD&D related to cybersecurity in particular. First, one of the things that we call for is the updating periodically of research and development roadmaps with regard to cyber. The world is changing very fast in this way, and at the moment, the research agenda is not keeping up with the changes that are in place. That would involve a number of things associated with capability to visualize what's going on in the grid, information detection and controls, sensor data in order to capture that kind of information, critical needs for a workforce in this area that is really up to snuff. There are very serious needs in terms of developing the expertise. I know you have limited time in yours, so I'll stop there and follow up if you'd like.
Okay, fantastic. It occurs to me that, one of the, our energy rates in California obviously are higher than the rates in Texas. And, while the federal government doesn't dictate what states charge, our user rates are higher because, we have tried to create that redundancy and so forth. And, my impression is Texas's rates are lower because they have chosen not to, do some of the physical measures to protect against these extreme weather events. Again, I understand the independence of Texas, and we can't go in there and tell them you've got to raise your rates. And but what levers do we have? Again, wanting to protect the citizens of Texas from another extreme event like this. And again, I don't know who best to answer that question, but what are things that we could do to compel Texans to do the right thing to protect their citizens?
Well, it is the case that Texas is independent from federal supervision under the Federal Power Act on rates. But for reliability purposes, Texas is under the supervision of the North American Electric Reliability Council, and that has implemented authority from Congress through the FERC to address reliability issues. So there is room there under current authority to put much stronger incentives, at least, for Texas to adopt different behaviors.
Right. Again, knowing many Texans, my preference isn't to tell the Texans what to do. Congressman Sessions would get mad at me if I did that. But it's to work together as the United States of America to make sure we protect all our citizens. So with that, I'll yield back.
Mr. Posey is next.
Thank you. And I really appreciate Congresswoman Johnson for holding this hearing. My questions are for Mr. Torres. Grid security is America's security. Do you agree with that statement?
I do.
Thank you. Any component plugged into the grid must be beyond reproach and ideally be sourced from trusted suppliers that are not affiliated with, controlled by, or manufactured by an adversarial country like China. This approach will support our energy independence. On page 8 of your testimony, you rightly mentioned that the new rise in cybersecurity vulnerabilities are real, especially as it relates to new energy technologies. And one trend that is a challenge for the system resilience, according to you, is the loss in control and knowledge of the technology supply chain. Could you explain to this committee how the Department of Energy has a system reliance challenge involving the loss in control and knowledge of the technology supply chain?
Sure. What I meant to say there, maybe I can elaborate on that, is the fact that the grid and elements that we're putting in the grid are driven by the market. And we operate when we procure energy components in a global market. And even when we purchase equipment and systems today from a US vendor, that doesn't necessarily imply that everything in that system or device is all manufactured by that vendor, because they typically buy subcomponents, other software elements from vendors that can be global. They could be centered in other countries. There could be chipsets, there could be firmware, there could be software and other pieces of hardware that comprise a system that we don't necessarily always have full control over. So understanding and providing some sort of guidance for how we can track what goes into those critical elements, especially when we're talking about things like black start. And if the power grid entirely blacks out, it could take days to weeks, maybe even longer to restart a large part of the grid. And so we have to be fully aware and confident in everything that's in the grid when we're restarting it. So those kinds of things I don't believe exist, especially for those kinds of procedures don't exist in the policies and directions of where we're going with some of the newer technologies. We don't have the same expectations for some of the new technologies yet. We've been managing nuclear power plants and coal plants and gas plants for a long time. And we know how to do that. But we don't necessarily understand as technologies are evolving what we need to do for things that may be added to the grid in the future.
Yeah, I hope that we can all agree it would be stupid for us to have power grids full of Chinese chip components. On May 1st of 2020, former President Trump signed an executive order 13920 to prohibit the acquisition of installation of certain bulk power system electric equipment sourced from foreign adversaries that pose a demonstrated undue risk. Are you familiar with the bulk power executive order that was signed and suspended by the current president until April 20th with executive order 13990?
Yes, I am.
Do you know if the current administration plans to reinstate the executive order to secure America's grid security?
I do not know.
If you find out, would you be kind enough to let us know?
I will work with the Department of Energy to provide the information they can.
Thank you very much, Mr. Torres. Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you very much.
Ms. Stevens is next.
Thank you so much. Usually, those of us in the northern states make the quips about how our friends in southern states, aren't used to cold weather. The reality is, in this case, there isn't a quip to make, because the crisis and the event that took place in Texas and in Oklahoma was catastrophic. And the history books will remember that the chairwoman of the Science, Space, and Technology Committee brought us together for this hearing to get an understanding of the research needs that must go in to making sure that we have a grid that works. Lives were lost, people were put into tons of pain, business was impacted, and in the United States of America, this is just something we never want to see in the middle of a pandemic, mind you. So I appreciate all the expert witness testimony here today. I did mention that I come from Michigan, and much of our conversation as it pertains to the grid in my state is focusing on electric vehicles. And I did want to ask a couple of you, and I think you're all maybe equipped to lean in on this, but how equipped is our grid for the arrival of electric vehicles, in the sense that they are right now comprising 1% of cars on the road, with projection to go much higher than that? And even if we, I think got much higher than we are, we'd have to look at grid capacity. So I'd be, Beth, I see you're nodding your head. If you want to jump in, that'd be great.
So I think, thank you for the question. I think it's a great question. It's certainly one that's being discussed and deliberated in the energy policy world. There certainly is spare capacity currently in the distribution system to allow, you know, me or my neighbor to go get an electric vehicle and plug it in, and that'll be fine. The questions then are, you know, once that becomes, you know, moves from 1% to 50% of the market, where are the stress points? Where do those exist? And I have every confidence that we can expand the grid and adjust the grid to manage that. I think also required is the interaction between, you know, advanced control aspects. Because, for example, you know, do you really want to be charging electric vehicles if there's a person next door that doesn't have electricity to their house because there's not enough supply, right? We have to be able to price and value the different uses of electricity, and we need the systems and software and techniques to be able to balance that.
Yeah, thank you. And let's also just talk, you know, I have about a minute and a half left. Let's just also talk about, and I'm sure some of my other colleagues are going to get into this, but the designing of a cleaner grid. So in a recent New York Times article, you know, they're obviously reflecting on 1/3 of America's greenhouse gas emissions are accounted for by transportation. You know, each year the electric cars and trucks are widely seen as a crucial part of the solution to climate change. It would also help if the electric grid that fueled these vehicles got a lot cleaner. Who has some thoughts about that and some of the ways in which we could make our electric grid cleaner?
Representative Stevens, I could answer that question. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, over the next 10 years, it would be possible if we continue to accelerate the pace of deployment of wind and solar, which I think we can do as these industries scale up, to increase the contribution of wind and solar from about 10% of our electricity today to as much as half by 2030. That would help significantly reduce carbon dioxide emissions from the electricity sector, which is the #2 total source of emissions today, about 1/4 of our greenhouse gas emissions, by reducing the use of coal-fired and natural gas generation, even if we keep the natural gas capacity around as a firm generation source. And so we can reduce emissions probably on the order of 70 to 80% over the next decade in the electricity sector by scaling up technologies that are affordable and ready to go today. And we can use that same decade to proactively invest in the clean, firm generation technologies that will ultimately need to replace or retrofit our existing natural gas fleet. If we do that, the power sector can help decarbonize transportation as well, as you've noted, through electric vehicles, as well as heating through heat pumps.
Great, thank you so much. I yield back.
Ms. Bice is next.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you to all the witnesses this morning. This first question quickly is directed at Ms. Garza. You mentioned earlier that forecasting is based on a 10-year look back. Can you expand on that? Because that seems really unbelievable to me.
So the weather conditions I'll be upfront and say, as a utility industry, and I consider myself part of that, we're not the most creative folks. And so all we know to do is what we have experienced. And when ERCOT looked at their seasonal forecast, even their extreme weather forecast, or the demand resulting from extreme weather for this winter, all they had in their records was the extreme winter we had in 2011. And that was a bad, we had rolling outages then. That was a bad situation. That was the most extreme we'd seen. And so that was the basis of an extreme forecast. And as it turned out, we suffered something worse than that. So we were not fully versed or fully aware of what the potential could be. And so understanding that potential is what I was trying to get at.
Thank you for clarifying that point. Mr. Jenkins, this question is for you. Would you be surprised to know that there has not been a nuclear reactor started online in over 30 years?
No, I would not be surprised. Actually, there was one reactor that has been restarted, the TVA brought online. But yeah, it's been a long time since we started construction or finished the project on time.
So how do you think that the adoption of the newest technology, which is the small cell nuclear reactors, could actually play into the electric grid and actually address some of the concerns with availability of electricity on a large scale?
Yeah, so new smaller modular reactors could be a more affordable source of clean, firm generation capacity, along with advanced geothermal energy, hydrogen combustion turbines or fuel cells, and carbon capture and sequestration on natural gas or coal or biomass-fired power plants. So all of those options, which this committee has supported in the past on a bipartisan basis, can be developed proactively over the next decade, can be introduced into the market, made cheaper over time, and can ultimately help contribute to a more resilient and cleaner electricity system.
I think that my point here is we've talked a lot about wind and solar, but nobody's bothered to talk about nuclear. And although it's a very touchy subject, and I understand the dynamics of that, I think it's something that we should be mindful of because nuclear sort of addresses some of the environmental issues that we see with, let's say, natural gas and coal. But the newest technology, which is just now coming around with these small nuclear reactors, actually provides an opportunity for us to increase capacity pretty greatly, actually, with a less of an impact overall to anyone.
Yeah, Congressman, just to emphasize also there are research needs that could help extend the life of our existing nuclear fleet, which is our largest source of carbon-free generation and a key foundation to build on going forward.
And I'm for your deal in investing more in research. I'm sure this committee on a bipartisan basis would also agree with that. My last question, we talked a lot about the challenges with Texas and the impact of the natural gas shutdown. Do you believe, and this question is for anyone, do you believe that the winterization of the natural gas delivery and production could have prevented the large-scale failure that we saw? I think it was a 30% reduction in delivery capacity.
Yes, I think this is a very important issue, and I'm really glad you brought it up. The incentives need to work to make sure that the generators are arranging for gas in a winterized way so that the gas supply can be helpful in critical periods like Texas just experienced. The National Academy's report calls for an effort to make the gas industry processing, production, delivery system more reliable and visible along the lines of what we already have on the electric side. So there is a lot of work that could be done there.
I think something I can add there is in terms of the visibility, I think there is a lot of scope in terms of, what the production happens and how it is impacted. We are still finding out exactly what the impact was on production losses because of winterization. The general answer is yes, it would have helped, but there's a lot of information needs and visibility needs there as well.
Yeah,
I'll just close. I'm sorry, go ahead.
And it goes both directions. So there were losses of power to compressor stations that are needed to keep pressure up in the gas pipelines as well. And so the interlinkages of these two systems is critical and needs to be explored and strengthened.
And I'll just wrap up my closing by saying that I think that we've learned a little bit about making sure that infrastructure across the United States, whether it be in Texas or in California, that we're keeping up with maintenance on that infrastructure to prevent things like huge power outages or wildfires from occurring because of the lack of infrastructure upkeep. I yield back, Madam Chair.
Ms. Wild is next.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Madam Chair, for convening this hearing. My district is one of the districts in Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania has long been an energy leader in our country. And one of the things that I really wanted to get into is Pennsylvania is connected to a multi-state grid, PJM interconnection, which moves electricity from New Jersey down to North Carolina, and as far west as Illinois, covering all or some of 15 states in the District of Columbia. Doctors Rye and Jenkins, I wanted to ask you, how can multi-state and regional grids reduce the risk our grid faces from severe weather and other threats relative to single state grids? And I'll just go ahead and ask the rest of the question. You can cover it as you will. What benefits would multi-state grids offer for reliability and resilience as we transition towards renewable energies like solar and wind?
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that question, Ms. Wild. The answers are, there's a lot of questions in there. the last major studies about the value of interconnecting ERCOT in big ways through AC ties to the other two grids were done a couple decades ago or over that. There have been other studies, smaller studies, but really not a very big, significant look. Times have changed a lot, technologies have changed a lot. All three grids have experienced increased penetration of renewables. And as Dr. Jenkins mentioned, that is a trend that is going to only grow. There is a very strong and immediate need to take a much more careful lead. It is just like how our social networks help us in hard times. We reach out for water, for food, for support. These interconnections work just the same way. If you're impacted differently, there is a lot of support and supplies that can be accessed through these interconnections. And it actually did happen even during this crisis for parts of the interconnection, bringing in some power from the eastern into the mid-continental region as well.
Dr. Jenkins, did you want to add something to that?
Yeah, no, I second everything that that Professor Rai just said. Just one thing to add is that I know that Texas has deliberately stayed out of the Eastern Interconnection or Western Interconnection in order to maintain its independent state-run electricity markets. That could continue to be maintained while expanding direct current interties with the rest of the Eastern or Western Interconnect. So there are some existing transfer capacities between the two, between the Eastern Interconnect and Texas, and between Mexico and Texas. Those could be extended or expanded, particularly into the West, into the Western Interconnect as well, without synchronizing the ERCOT grid with the rest of the system. And so there's not really a tension there between greater ability to import and export power and the independence of the ERCOT market. And I think that's an area that the state should consider how much of that investment is worthwhile going forward.
Well, thank you. That's very illuminating. I also wanted to focus on storage a little bit, which is one of the issues that energy sector executives in my district talk about all the time in connection with clean energy transition, the need for scalable, efficient, and affordable energy storage so that our grid will stay reliable. How would that kind of energy storage capacity have lessened the impact of the extreme weather in Texas? And my follow-up is, what research questions should the scientific community and DOE investigate to ensure that energy storage capacity is resilient?
So I would say that the bulk of the energy storage capacity we're adding to the grid today are lithium-ion batteries, the same kind of battery storage in electric vehicles. Those are very affordable and getting cheaper every year, and provide a lot of flexibility on short timescales over the course of a few hours. So unfortunately, in this crisis, if Texas had more battery storage capacity, it would have helped at the beginning of the crisis, but those batteries would have run out of power on Monday and not provided much more beyond that. So in terms of research needs, there are other reliability and resiliency threats that shorter duration batteries can help with, other than these sustained outages. And also longer duration energy storage technologies that could provide sustained output for days or even weeks could potentially play a larger role in these sorts of events. But ultimately, long events like this require firm generation capacity that can sustain its output without an energy limitation as storage has.
Thank you. And Dr. Rai, did you want to add anything to that in my last 15 seconds?
Just very quickly, that there is a very important need to also look at large-scale demand-side engagement and how that can be engaged even for longer durations, because that's a very tough nut to crack with storage for a long time.
Thank you so much. With that, I yield back, Madam Chair.
Mr. Feenstra is next. We can't hear you, Mr. Feenstra. It looks like you have a headset connected.
Mr. Feenstra, next to where you can mute and unmute, there's a little triangle. You can click on that and check and see what audio devices you are using. Still cannot hear you. No, sir, still cannot hear you.
Hear me now?
We can hear you.
Oh, sorry about that. I just wanted to say thank you, Madam Chair and Ranking Member Lucas. Before I start, I just wanted to thank each of the witnesses for their testimony and sharing their extensive research and educated opinions with us. You know, the weather this February in Iowa, you know, we saw a lot of the drastic things. Our temperatures dropped below 28, below zero. We had 24 inches of snow. Part of my district, yeah, we saw rolling blackouts, and you know, it was a pretty big deal. It's important that we all do what we can to protect and modernize the grid that we have to ensure the resiliency and protect from these large-scale rolling blackouts. So the question is for Dr. Jenkins. You highlighted the importance of clean electricity to an affordable transition to a net zero emissions economy in your testimony. My district in Iowa is one of the top wind energy areas in the country. New wind and solar generation is in our region, but is tremendously bottlenecked by the transmission constraints. Mason City, a town in my district, will be the home to one of the 2 power converter stations for a organization called the SUOO Green HVDC link transmission line. This line will power renewable energy from Iowa into northern Illinois, with being connected with a PJM power market. So this is my question. How do we create transmission lines like this that create redundancy and increase clean energy availability and transport this energy to densely populated regions like the East Coast and Chicago and things like that? We're trying to do this in Iowa, but again, we have a tremendous bottleneck that's going on with our transmission.
Yeah, as you know, in Iowa and across much of the country, we have an incredible American resource in the form of wind power, as well as solar energy potential across much of the country. But to use that effectively, we have to be able to bring that energy from where it's generated to where we consume it. It's much the same as with our natural gas and oil resources in the country, or our coal resources, where we have to build the natural gas pipelines and the rail lines to bring, you know, natural gas and coal to where we need it. And so a modern transmission system that's built to export wind and solar power from where it's cheapest to our cities is a critical piece of a affordable and more resilient electricity system that'll benefit economically those exporting regions. And there are research needs as well that could help us improve the cost of direct current transmission lines, converter stations, and other components of those systems, as well as identify cheaper ways to underground lines, which could help reduce public opposition to expansion. So it's maybe I'll defer to Sue Tierney for more on the regulatory side of things, but there are significant research questions there for this committee to think about as well.
And that's a great point. I mean, this line is an underground line running adjacent to the railroad system. So it's a perfect line, secure and everything like that. I would ask any one of you, I mean, what incentives would you look at to try to create private sector dollars to create these transmission lines?
Could I start by saying that in most instances, it's not financial incentives that are the problem with bottlenecking the lines. It is really related to ensuring that there is public participation in the process and ensuring that there are regional issues that are taken into consideration in the siting of new transmission lines. The National Academy's report has requested that Congress enact and declare a new national transmission policy that not just is about resiliency and reliability, but it's also about opening up regions of the country with very high quality wind resources, for example, and that is something that should be taken into consideration when states and the federal government are acting to approve lines. The SOO line is pretty amazing in terms of how it was developed and cited, and I think it's a great example of the kinds that we should see in the future.
Mr. Feenstra, if I could add quickly, one of the great examples of infrastructure investments in Texas has been bringing much of the wind that is generated in the western side of Texas into the load centers, much to the south and the east. And that was done over a period of about a decade with over $7 billion of investment. And that required, just as Sue mentioned, a lot of public participation as well as a very, very long and detailed regulatory process to get into it. But it was done, and it has played a tremendous role in diversification of the energy system here in Texas and will be important in the future as well.
Yeah, thank you for both your comments on that. I absolutely agree. I think the other big issue is the regulatory issues with Sioux Energy and these organizations that are trying to do transmission lines. They're really struggling. It takes years to get regulatory approvals on these things. And if we could turn down that timeline, that'd be fantastic. Thank you, and I yield back.
Mr. Bowman is next.
Thank you, Madam Chair and Ranking Member Lucas, and thank you to our witnesses. Dr. Rai, you emphasized the need for better communication and coordination in events like what happened in Texas, and the need to organize the voluntary reduction of demand. When it comes to threats to the grid and energy shortages, do you have additional thoughts on how we can design emergency preparedness efforts so that they are truly community-driven and equitable? Are there any precedents for how this can work well that you had in mind while crafting your testimony?
That's a great question, Mr. Bowman. I would like to just remind, as I was with my family during the crisis, and it was an utter chaos after a couple of days in the household. Literally, there was very little coordinated information that was coming to us. We were banking on neighbors and other friends for any little bit of information other than high-level system information. When in times of, there is a lot of precedent, sir. For example, in times of major hurricanes, there's a lot of great work that has happened in this country over the last several decades. There's a lot of great infrastructure and significant investment that goes on into weather forecasting and emergency system preparation. When ahead of time information is shared, then people pad up, people get ready and leave, get to safety. It does tie back to security concerns, and in particular that is an added complexity in the electricity system. If an event like this further gets complicated, as was mentioned by Dr. Torres, that in events like this, if further in the restart process, in the black start process, you have additional cybersecurity related threats, that can really complicate matters a lot. So, I would say when multiple events can really get out of control, really focusing on those events and crafting solutions that take those matters into consideration.
Could I just add to that briefly?
On the equity question.
Oh, sorry, go ahead, Sue.
Please.
Well, on the equity question, there are things that utilities are doing around the country in vulnerable areas where there are disadvantaged populations. There are pre-positioning of community heating or cooling centers where there's that will remain connected to the grid as a critical service area. There are pre-positioning of crews to help with addressing restoration of service. And those are all part of a resilient grid, planning and getting it ready for when you need it. And that's really important for folks who just really need electricity for heating and cooling.
Yeah, I was just going to echo that it's not just the resilience of the system, but also our preparedness to respond when accidents and crises do strike that leads to the human cost of these crises. And so anticipating these kinds of extreme weather events and better preparing for them, particularly with a focus on the most vulnerable populations, can make a huge difference in the economic and physical human toll of these kinds of events.
Mr. Bowman, very quickly, one untold part of the story is how much local community and local leaders got together and really got the state and our communities through this. It was one of the biggest, most positive untold stories. But the truth is that in events like this, which might actually get more frequent, we cannot let it down to the households and the communities to always fend for themselves. There is need for federal and state action at a very high level.
Okay. Thank you all very much for those answers. I yield back my time.
Mr. Overnolte is next.
Well, thank you very much to our panelists. This has been a fascinating discussion. My first question is for Dr. Jenkins. You said something in your testimony that I found very interesting. You attributed a lot of these failures to a failure to require contingency plans, and you said some interesting things about risk when you drew an analogy with insurance policies. So I wanted to ask you about that risk, because in my home state of California, one of the risks to power generation is earthquakes. And what you quickly find is there is no way to completely insulate power generation from that risk. You know, you have to accept that a certain severity of earthquake is the one that you're planning for, and that anything beyond that is going to affect your resiliency. And so I'm wondering, you know, how do we parse this risk? I mean, at what point do we say we want our grid to be 99.99% resilient, but not, 0.999% resilient because it would be too expensive? How do we do the math on that?
Yeah, I do think it's a challenging equation, and the threats that each region faces are going to be different. And that's one of the things I tried to emphasize in the testimony. So for Texas, it might be these extreme cold events, but elsewhere it's wildfires or earthquakes. So I'd say there's two things. One is to think about the relatively cost-effective measures that can be taken to push back that failure mode. So that's a little bit stronger earthquake before things go down, or a little bit colder temperatures before the system fails. And there are a number of these measures that are quite affordable. You know, winterization of wind turbines, for example, heat tracing of critical sensors and feed pipes, for example, as resilience for cold. That could have been taken in Texas and were pointed at in previous reports, and in many cases were just not taken or not maintained. And so there are some affordable things that can be done that push back the breaking point. And then the second thing, which I think we're emphasizing in the response to Congressman Bauman's question, is that we also need to think about how we respond. And I think in earthquakes, that's something California is well prepared for, right? That that earthquakes are a risk, and there are emergency and contingency plans in place. And I think what climate change means is that we have to check our blind spots on those kinds of weather-related risks, because if the 2011 storm in Texas was used as the high watermark for the threat, and the reality was that was inadequate to plan for the severity of what could have been possible. So that's where future climate research that could help us better understand how those extreme threats are evolving and what steps could be taken to better prepare for them would be very helpful, because the past, as I said, is not a good guide for the future anymore.
Right. Well, I mean, I think your point is that there were steps that could and should have been taken in Texas that were reasonably cost effective. Yeah. But I think that everyone needs to realize that a 100% resilient grid is statistically impossible. Exactly. At some point, you're going to get to a level where the additional cost is not worth the reduction in risk. So there's only going to be a point at which, the grid could statistically fail.
That's right, and that's why I'm emphasizing the response side of things too, because it's a question of cost and the risk you're mitigating. And if you can use operational strategies and responses to these crises when systems do fail to minimize the cost, then that also means you're less vulnerable as well. So it's both sides of the equation that we have to pay attention to.
Mr. If I may add a couple of points here, I would just want to remind that there were three major things that could have been done that did not really require a massive, long-term investment or rethinking. And, I had already pointed out those include, winterization. Those also include engaging with demand, as well as, very simple things as, what really is your critical load, right? Keeping track would have been very simple. Something I think is very important to keep in mind is, I mentioned in my testimony, the scale of the damages, right? We cannot just look at what was the value of the lost load. Rather, there are damages to water infrastructure, there are economic damages, there are governments, local governments failing. And when you bring those things in, early estimates are putting that over $100 billion. And my back of the envelope calculations say, even if you were to require winterization of the entire gas and power infrastructure, it is not going to be of the same scale. It's going to be an order of magnitude lower. Right. So, you need to keep both sides of the equation in mind to really find out what that balance is.
Sure. Yeah, I think we all can agree on that. And Dr. Rai, while I've got you here, let me ask a last question. You said something in your testimony I thought was very interesting, which was that one of the biggest failures, in your opinion, was a lack of voluntary demand reduction. And I just wanted to ask, how we would go about affecting voluntary demand reduction, because the traditional way is to do it through market pricing, which happened in some parts of Texas. And I think in retrospect, we look at that and realize that it was too quick. People didn't realize the high price that they were paying for power, and that probably that's not a good way of going about it in the future. So how should we go about it?
That's a great question. Voluntary reduction doesn't mean it should be free. It just that, it was not, you can't enforce it. But when there are disruptions of this scale, and just as you mentioned, we cannot completely 100% prove things. So we should be expecting disruptions like this here and elsewhere. In those types of situations, really engaging in messaging and engaging that demand becomes very important. And I have offered, I don't pretend to have all the solutions, but that's so important, such a big part of the question that it needs to be studied further.
Yeah, well, I mean, in other parts of the country, we have voluntary reduction programs where in return for a lower electric rate, large industrial consumers agree to on demand reduce their consumption, right? But I don't think that that is on a scale that would be big enough to solve the problem in Texas. So, it certainly bears, further discussion because I don't see how we get from where we are to where we want to be.
And much more social science research.
In on that, I'm sorry, Sue, if I could chime in on that. ERCOT is a summer-focused electric system, and we do have significant demand programs reacting and responsive to in the summertime. And one of the limitations was the limitations of those programs and those services, their availability in the winter. So.
Well, great. Well, I see we're out of time, but thank you very much for your testimony. It's been a fascinating discussion. I yield back.
Mr. Caston is next.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And it's so nice to see so many old friends on this panel from my prior life in the energy world. Want to start with a couple questions for Dr. Jenkins, a couple short ones and one sort of meatier one. First one, El Paso had about the same weather. Did they have any outages in this recent period?
I don't believe there are any rolling blackouts, but I could be wrong about that.
Is there a simple reason for that?
Well, I'm not sure it's a purely simple reason, but they are connected to the rest of the Western Interconnect. And so they could draw power from much further away in conditions that were not quite so cold.
So they're outside of ERCOT.
Yeah. They also, I think, took more proactive steps to weatherize their system, as I understand it.
So to that point, I'd like to ask unanimous consent to introduce a document for the record. It's entitled Outages and Curtailments During the Southwest Cold Event of February 1 through 5, 2011 from FERC and NERC. Dr. Jenkins, you familiar with this report?
Yes, I am.
It strikes me that some of their recommendations talking about what should have happened in 1989 and weren't done in 2011, is it safe to characterize this report as saying that the events that recently happened in Texas were not only foreseeable, but were actually foreseen?
Yes, I think that's correct. You could almost do a find and replace for the dates in the 2011 study and replace 1989 with 2011 and 2011 with 2021, and it would still read, very similar to the reports that I'm sure will be released after this event. It's kind of eerie.
Well, I raise that because I really want to impress on my colleagues to please read this report, because there's an understandable political bias for everybody to say, we couldn't have seen this coming, and we did. And we need to make sure that we incorporate those recommendations. My somewhat meatier question for you, and I do want to get one question for Dr. Tierney, so apologize for being brief here. The North American Reliability Council imposes all sorts of requirements on load-serving entities on the electric grid that have requirements for backup generation and redundant transmission and one day in 10 years outage requirements, all those details. Is there an equivalent standard for our natural gas infrastructure?
Not that I'm aware of, but I defer to the other panelists if they know more.
No, there is no such reliability organization or standard for the gas industry.
So as we get to grids that are more gas dependent, should we be thinking about something like a standard like that for the gas industry? Because it strikes me that that's the weak point in our system. And Dr. Tierney, I have a follow-up question for you, but since you jumped in, go ahead.
Yeah, I want to make sure to highlight the recommendation of the 2021 National Academy study on the future of the grid, where we call for Congress to do exactly that. So it's a very important thing given this interdependency between the two energy systems.
So I want to pivot there, and Dr. Tierney, I'm glad you jumped in, because as a fellow former New Englander, I've always thought of ERCOT as being the New England ISO with less interconnect and more electric heating, as far as the dynamics that affect it. And and I mention that because we have these issues where when systems get tight, gas is preferentially dispatched for heating as it was, except that in New England, there isn't this huge surge of electric heating load that comes on. And as we think about how to do what we must do to get to a zero carbon future, we've got a national policy that broadly talks about let's get to zero carbon in the electric sector as soon as we can, and then let's quote unquote electrify everything. And Texas is in many ways sort of a microcosm, if not all the way down that path, but the beginning of it, because loads that are served with other fuels and the rest of the grid are significantly served with electricity in Texas. And we got that constraint on the system. As we talk about an infrastructure bill going forward, given as if my math is right, roughly a little less than 40% of the total energy we use in this country is for electricity, almost 50% is for heating in the industrial, commercial, industrial sector. If we are going to electrify everything and we are going to shift to a zero carbon electric grid, the implication is that we are massively increasing our generation fleet. We are massively relocating the generation fleet, and we're massively relocating where the load is. And we better be talking about transmission. So what should we be thinking about? Set aside who pays. What is the quantum of money we need to be thinking about, round to the nearest $10 billion if you need to invest in a transmission system that is actually going to enable us to connect clean generation to a electrified load?
I don't have that number at my fingertips, but I would be happy to provide you with information after the hearing if that would be helpful. I completely agree with you. The transmission plays an absolutely critical role here. We know from many NREL studies where Dr. Torres is located that bigger regions, interconnected, and transmission enabling those bigger regions to perform is really important. Where you are living today, there are these various interconnections across different regional transmission organizations. Those need to be bulked up. And certainly New England is interested in enhancing its transmission capability to a variety of diverse areas where there are high quality wind. In a stimulus package, there can be things that that Congress would adopt as part of financial incentives to get shovels or, let's see, electrical wires put in place on the system.
If I could add to that, Representative Caston, the Net Zero America study that I helped publish at Princeton looked at this transition over the next decade towards a net zero emissions economy, estimated on the order of $350 billion in incremental investment in transmission over the next decade alone. That'd be about a 60% increase in transmission capacity over the next 10 years. This is a huge undertaking and a huge opportunity for investment and job creation as part of an infrastructure package.
Well, I'd love to follow up with all of you. I'm out of time, but I do just want to leave the comment here that the scale of what we are talking about in transmission in our infrastructure plan is a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of that. And if we don't start to grapple with the numbers you're talking about, we're going to be wrong-footed. So let's continue the conversation. Thank you, and I yield back.
Mr. Cass, if I could just throw something in there. There's a set of electrification future studies that we've been conducting with the Department of Energy that really helps us understand how the loads will grow across the different sectors, and that would be very useful in the planning. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Garcia is next.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you, Madam Chairwoman and Ranking Member Lucas for pulling this together, and thanks to the witnesses. This is an absolutely critical discussion. And what we saw in Texas last month was a tragedy. It was heartbreaking, and in my opinion, was something that we, as Americans, should have been able to prevent. I represent a district in Southern California that these types of scenarios are not foreign to us, unfortunately. It's not necessarily the extreme cold, but in our case, it's the extreme heat and it's the winds that have led to, in my district, close to 30 power outages in the last, call it 10 months. We don't live in Venezuela. We live in the United States of America, yet our utilities behave and the public utility companies responsible for power generation in our state behave as if it is Venezuela. These problems are a product of challenges provided by Mother Nature, but it is mankind and the folks responsible for our utility companies and those who represent us in government who are responsible for the failure. We have failed to overcome the challenges that Mother Nature has provided. And I resonate with the comments by my colleague, Mr. Caston, that this is a repeated lesson learned over the last several decades. In my district, we lose power when the winds get above 30 miles per hour. That's not a scenario that one would call a force majeure. That's not an anomaly, especially not in Southern California. That happens on a very frequent basis. We've lost lives, we've risked thousands of lives. We've been surrounded by flames while we have no power, and we've been effectively not only losing our power, but also our water because many of my constituents are on wells that are electrically driven. So my question to the panel, and I think we can start with Mr. Torres, is how do we ensure that we're not playing whack-a-mole here across all 50 states and our territories? How do we ensure that what we saw in Texas doesn't happen in other states, maybe not for the same reasons, maybe for different reasons, and that these lessons learned that you are collecting as a result of the incidents in February in Texas are being disseminated? And it may not be for cold weather, but this grid hardening and the lessons learned, what venues, what media forum, summits, and or discussions are you having to make sure that the lessons learned from Texas, California, and other states are being applied to the rest of the United States so that we're not playing whack-a-mole here indefinitely?
All right, thank you, Mr. Garcia. I can't speak to all of the things that are going on. I can talk to some of the things that we've been doing within NREL and the Department of Energy through the GMI activities and Grid Modernization Lab Consortium. Those are strong collaborations across the industry with the utilities, with the vendors, the various stakeholders. And I fully agree with you that we really have a patchwork of perspectives and policies across the different elements of the grid. And there needs to be more communication discussion as to what are the roles, responsibilities, and the implications of those differences, because we're all trying to achieve a common good here. We all want our lights to stay on. We want to avoid major events like this. And so we need to understand what should each part be for every member. What can we be doing? And what are the changes that we're that the different participants are implying? How could that affect the overall resilience of the grid? And can there be opportunities for shared costs, shared investments? Those kinds of discussions, I fully agree, need to continue so that we can avoid and mitigate some of these kinds of disasters.
Thank you, sir. And I would just submit to this body and all of us at the federal level that our investments in research into the grid hardening and expansion efforts should include not only the conduits of power between cities and generation plants, but also conduits between entities and bureaucrats who are responsible for making sure lessons learned are proliferated as well. I personally believe that we need to hold the public utility companies accountable for this. This is negligence. This is loss of life. This was foreseeable in many cases, and we as Americans deserve better than this. I thank, again, the chairwoman for opening the aperture on this a little bit further, and I just want to reinforce to my colleagues that this is not a problem unique to Texas. We will lose more Americans in other states as we start seeing some of these incidents expand across the nation. I yield back.
Mr. Foster is next.
Well, thank you. And first, to my colleagues from Texas and to some of our witnesses, I feel your pain, as I too had a daughter and son-in-law trapped in Austin and living off their automobile battery for days. And I'd like to mention their #1 recommendation, which is that everyone in Texas be given at least a rudimentary understanding on how to drive a car on roads after a snow or ice storm. Okay, not the subject of our hearing, but an important point. Now, Mr. Torres and Mr. Jenkins, you mentioned a number of threats to grid reliability, including weather, EMP, wildfires, and others. Many of these can be ameliorated by undergrounding the utilities, an approach which carries multiple secondary benefits like eliminating eyesores, improving real estate property values, preventing wildfires, and so on. So what are the promising directions of federal R&D into lowering the cost of underground utilities? I'm thinking of like swarms of robots that toil away underground to bury utilities, both in urban and rural areas, or just simply lower cost conductor, insulator, power conversion strategies for high voltage DC lines and so on. Are there specific programs that have been defined that could absorb increased federal funding for this research? Given that industry is pretty conservative in what it's willing to invest in. What would an underground power transmission moonshot look like? So any one of you want to take a stab at that?
I can't say that I'm an expert on underground DC systems. One of the biggest challenges is the access and the siting to that. There definitely can be further investments to advance the various technologies to improve on that, to improve on the conductor materials and so on. There also can be done things at a local level. The underground lines can occur at the transmission and distribution level as well. There are places where flooding could be an issue. So you really need to understand where this kind of technology makes sense as well, and if it will actually resolve the issue and weigh out the costs overall. But I believe in looking at a portfolio of options, including DC lines, including undergrounding, including microgrids. So I think we're at a point in the evolution of technology and research and information here that we have many more possibilities. So I would just caution that we not select just one particular pathway.
Yeah, maybe just one thing to add for the committee is to understand that direct current lines are a little bit like the getting on the highway, where you can only get on and off at certain on and off ramps. And those are the AC to DC converter stations that we need to hook up these lines to our synchronized AC grid. And there are significant opportunities for innovation in cost reductions in those converter stations, which could allow us to make better use of HVDC lines embedded within our broader AC transmission system. So I think that is an area for research that could be, increased funding could go a long way.
Yeah, well, if there have been specific plans made for, a program that could absorb significant larger funding on, cost reduction research, basically, because it seems like a big part of that technology has really not changed in the 1960s. And I think, if you look, for example, at the cost reduction in microwaves, we bought a microwave oven, which is, basically a magnetron in a metal box. With a timer, and that's a drop from $250 of $1960 to about $42 today. Not through revolutionary technology, but simply step-by-step cost reduction. And I think that that's really an area where we could benefit from investment. And if in a moment I can have an estimate of my time left from the staff, it would be useful.
1 minute, Mr. Foster.
Okay, so many of the really destructive scenarios to the grid, whether they're cyber attacks or accidental, have to do with messing around with synchronizing the phase or frequency of the AC generation and distribution systems. In contrast, DC transport systems, can be protected by relatively simple systems, like diode clamps, overvoltage protection, and so on, that don't rely on software that can be corrupted and can be much more easily made immune to natural and artificial electromagnetic pulse events and so on. Has this been looked at, really the benefits in terms of disaster resilience of high voltage or DC systems generally compared to AC systems?
Could I answer very briefly by saying that there has been a lot of research on the technical and regulatory issues associated with HVDC DC lines. But I think your question and comments really calls out for asking DOE to do a moonshot type roadmap for that kind of research that would really take things over the hump. As one thinks about the expansion of the system that is going to be required, and the natural resistance that people have to the visual effects of new power lines, I think it was a really important area of work. from a scientific basis.
Thank you. And so I will happy to collaborate with any of my colleagues on brainstorming what that would look like. And my time is up and I yield back.
Mr. Babin is next.
Yes, sir. Thank you so very much. Really appreciate your witnesses being here to talk about something that is so important. When Winter Storm Uri swept across and through Texas, thousands of my constituents and millions across the state found themselves in life and death circumstances, without heat, without water, and access to essential goods in the coldest storm in modern Texas history. We must address the failures and subsequently support policies that make sure that this catastrophe never happens again. I'd also like to thank Mr. Foster for his suggestion, because many Texans do not know how to drive in these conditions. Thankfully, because they're so very rare in the state of Texas. But our energy sources must be predictable, dependable, and affordable. Unfortunately, the national trend of increasing regulatory policies and green energy subsidies has led to states, in this case Texas, incorporating more unreliable power into the grid while decreasing reliance on proven and dependable baseload energy resources. We must recognize the limits of energy sources such as wind and solar. If Texas had been on the grid that was 100% renewable, as many continue to advocate for, this weather scenario would have been much worse. Thankfully, natural gas, which is a vital contributor to our Texas grid, would carry the lion's share of the load at this emergency, excuse me. And so, Madam Chair, I ask unanimous consent to submit for the record a one-page fact sheet from the American Exploration and Production Council, which details the role of natural gas during this February's winter event.
Without objection.
Thank you. So what is the solution? I firmly believe that market-based solutions will better ensure increased grid resiliency. As Pat Woods, previous FERC chairman, said recently, I can assure you the competitive model is the better way to bring price, service, and technological innovation benefits to customers. And so let me also briefly mention that many continue to say the source of the blackouts was Texas's insistence on being part of an independent grid, thus depriving it of ample power from local states and wise, quote unquote, regulation from the federal government. But joining the federal grid is not the solution and would have far-reaching consequences, which would include greater market volatility and much higher prices. So my question to Mr. Garza, as the oil fields have attempted to become more green friendly, they have electrified. Should there be more research and development into microgrids or non-grid electricity? Part of the reason gas couldn't get out of the ground during this storm was because the devices to get it out of the ground simply ran out of electricity. Do you believe that forcing these different types of energy sources to all become electric is the right direction to be heading in?
Well, sir, thank you for that question. Yes, there certainly were situations where gas production and transportation facilities which are dependent on electricity found their electricity cut off. And I would attribute that to a failure of communication or a failure of understanding by the local distribution utility that they indeed had a critical gas production facility connected to their system. An example that came out during the recent legislative hearings here in Texas is that one of the utilities had about 30 gas facilities on their critical load list before the event, and during the event they identified 130 more. So clearly there's a failure of identification, and given the interdependence of electricity and gas, the codependence of electricity and gas, we need to figure out a way to improve that communication and coordination.
Thank you, ma'am. And then do you also believe that the current trajectory of research and development funding is doing enough to ensure that we achieve better grid resiliency?
Well, I always think there's more to do and more to learn. Clearly, we've we failed that test here in Texas. And so we need to learn from those lessons, and we need to figure out how those lessons can be broadly applied to the rest of the country. And to me, it seems that we do that through appropriate research and dissemination.
Mr.
All
Babin?
right, thank you very much. And I think, yes, ma'am.
I just wanted to say, clearly the National Academy's Committee on Resilience of the Grid and the Future of the Electric System believe that there needs to be at least a doubling, if not a tripling, of parts of the research chain. So I encourage that to your attention.
Okay, thank you very much. And I see that I'm out of time, so I will yield back. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Mr. Kildee is next.
Thank you. Well, first of all, thanks for holding this hearing. It's obviously an important hearing. I would like to address, and this is something that my colleague from Michigan, Ms. Stevens, raised, and it has to do with the effect of the development of electrification of transportation of our entire fleet of vehicles over many decades will have on grid resilience, or what factors we need to consider when it comes to that inevitable development. And so I wonder, if, Mr. Torres, if you wouldn't mind perhaps reiterating, because I missed part of the answer that you gave or that was given when Ms. Stevens raised this issue. If you would mind just giving us some of the thoughts that we need to consider regarding grid resilience in the era of obvious development and movement toward electrification of vehicles. And then I do have an interesting question as to whether or not there's another side to that coin, especially when it comes to heavy duty vehicles. When we think about the fact that in a case like this, perhaps on a smaller scale, we would have present on the ground in communities, large, essentially batteries on wheels, fully charged vehicles, school buses, for example, that might be of some utility in providing temporary relief in the case of, a blackout of some type. So if you could just touch on those two areas, I'd appreciate it.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Kildee. So what we're seeing in some of the studies I mentioned early, electrification future studies, is there's a high potential for transportation to be a significant new load on the grid. And we see that there would probably need to be some changes at the distribution level, where we charge, but even charging management systems. So not everybody would come home and charge at exactly the same time. Maybe people are charging at night, but you can do it at different times. So all those kinds of things are definitely achievable with some more research. With regards to things like vehicles providing support, there's a potential with fleets, with bus fleets that are maybe only driving certain times, say school buses, but then they sit there most of the day. During that time, they could potentially offer some energy to the grid to help support it during time of need. Other, light duty vehicles, we'd need to understand in the future when you have dynamic generation locations, where are these vehicles, and can they plug into some portal where they could offer some support to the grid? Those kinds of things would still need to be looked at, business models and so on. But given the fact that transportation is on a path to at least some level of increased electrification, I think it offers opportunity for us to look at how it can be used to add grid resilience. What are the implications if we don't take into account the growth for light duty and heavy duty vehicles? Light duty vehicles at 150 kilowatt level charging, heavy duty, up to a megawatt scale charging, could have large impacts on the grid. At the same time, if we do it wisely, it could also potentially add some support.
Mr. Kildee, if I may add a couple points. The increasing trend in electrification for transportation, it highlights one additional interdependence. We already talked about how gas, electricity, and then food and water are connected. We are seeing another transportation sector getting. So the interdependencies are going to get more complicated. So that's point one. Second, your observation is absolutely right on. We at the University of Texas have had demonstration projects that have showed that using buses and similar, what you mentioned, storage on wheels, you could actually support fire stations and similar critical infrastructure for certain durations of time, right? You know, not for very long. And the third piece is your comment around large vehicles. That brings in additional element, which is hydrogen. Especially, it's very important for Texas. There's a lot of scope there, but it also adds to that diversification of energy sources and supply in critical times. So that's a really very promising avenue as well.
Well, thank you. I appreciate those comments. Only 2% right now of American vehicles are electric vehicles, but we know where the market is going, and we actually have this moment in time to prepare for that future, to begin to set the stage for not only greater resilience, but less dependency in a cleaner environment. So this is a timely hearing. I thank the chairwoman for raising it, and I particularly thank the panelists for really good testimony. So thank you, and I yield back.
Mr. LaTurner is next.
Thank you, Madam Chair and Ranking Member Lucas, for holding this hearing. I want to thank the panelists for being with us. Like many of its neighbors, the state of Kansas was hit hard by the winter storm in February. Subjected to sub-zero temperatures, many were without power and heat for days. Power and fuel sources that we rely on every day failed, and we weren't prepared. We cannot allow this to happen again. It is my hope that this hearing will shed light on future opportunities to strengthen and fortify our power grid against threats, both physical and cyber, and examine how we can leverage our country's research and development capabilities to make those opportunities a reality. I'd like Mr. Torres and Ms. Garza to address this question. It's a two-part question. How interconnected are the various regional grids? And while you consider that, the connectivity of the grids, what is the probability that an outage or cyber event in one part of the country can have a cascading effect on the whole system?
Okay, I'll go ahead and go first. Thank you, Mr. LaTurner. So there are only, a small set of DC ties interconnecting the eastern and western interconnect. And then there's also a tie between, I believe there's a Texas and the eastern interconnect. Not a lot of power flows between those systems at this point. They don't really depend on power flows going across. So at this point, not a lot of dependency from that perspective. With regards to some of the cybersecurity potential issues here, the potential consequence would depend on the type of event, where the entry was, what system was compromised. The grid is really made up of a whole bunch of small grids. There's a lot of different utilities. So, we're always we're as strong as our weakest link. So having some consistency on the expectations in policies and even technologies and approaches is really good. I say as a whole, we're doing a pretty good job at the bulk grid level. NERC has jurisdiction over the larger utilities, that are providing power over the bulk grid, the high voltage level. Once you get down to the distribution level, they are doing the best they can as well. They are, developing standards and so on, but they don't necessarily have the same level of resources. So finding ways to levelize and provide, given that, potentially a connection anywhere can be a connection everywhere if cybersecurity is not managed appropriately. There was I guess the first power grid outage caused by a cyber attack in 2015 in Ukraine. Could that happen here? Don't know. We've been, in my career, I've been looking at this since the 90s, and the grid has evolved considerably since. I will say that I don't believe that we're paying enough attention to what the threats are ahead, because we don't know how quickly the cyber threat is evolving. It's evolving very, very quickly. So we need to really move toward more inherently resilient systems, knowing that we don't always know where that next attack is coming from, or even what it might be, but the system would be resilient, be able to isolate and detect something's wrong, and be able to reconstruct and get the system back up and running as soon as possible. So thanks.
I appreciate that. And Ms. Garza, if you don't mind.
Yeah, sure. So from a interconnected standpoint, we've talked about Texas's limited direct current interconnections with both the Eastern Interconnect and a few with Mexico as well. The point of these different grids is that they are operated synchronously. That is, they're moving together, and the DC connection allows that separateness, allows those synchronous operations to be separated. So in this situation, if we'd had some more connections to the Eastern Interconnect, I'm not sure that that would have been very helpful, because all of the regions around us to the north and to the east were suffering their own issues, as you just alluded to, in Kansas and all the way down into Louisiana. The cold weather descended across the center of the country. So incrementally, I'm not sure there would have been much opportunity for improvement. If you were talking about sort of national bulk, high capacity HVDC lines, broadly across the country, yes, that might have been valuable. I'm not sure you could justify that expense just on a winter resilience need in Texas or more locally, but there are other benefits of that kind of interconnection as well.
Thank you both very much. I yield back.
Mr. Beyer is next.
Thank you very much. I'd love to start with Dr. Jenkins, and with the sort of foundational existential question, Dr. Jenkins. I know you're an MIT PhD, which I very much respect. So here's the question. We have this feedback loop. We burn fossil fuels, which are amazingly efficient, lots of BTUs concentrated, they're easy to move, easy to burn, which leads to climate change and global warming, which leads to extreme events. And then we adapt to this by burning more fossil fuel. Does this make any sense? And is this not the equivalent of smashing your hand with a hammer, noticing that it hurts, is bleeding? So keep hammering harder?
Well, it's a little bit, the challenge is a little bit, to use a different metaphor, like trying to build the airplane while flying it, right? So we have to keep our critical infrastructures and our economy going as we transition as quickly and affordably as possible to a cleaner energy system that breaks that link. And so we can't do that overnight, but we can move much faster than we have historically. And that means both greater reliance on variable renewable resources, as well as cleaner, firm technologies that can supplant fossil fuels, or could even allow us to continue to use fossil fuels with carbon capture and sequestration.
So Dr. Jenkins, let me continue on this theme. And I know you're not a regulator, you're a scientist, but Governor Abbott said in a statement yesterday that he'd asked for and accepted the head of the PUC's, the Public Utility Commission's, resignation. And this was after the Texas Monthly had reported that he told out-of-state investors, think Wall Street, on a telephone call that he would work to, quote, throw the weight of the commission behind stopping calls to reverse billions of dollars in overcharges for wholesale electricity during the storm. Because it turns out that ERCOT had forgotten to roll back its prices from the sky-high levels as the power came back on. And independent agency originally thought it was only a $16 billion overcharge. They dialed it back to $6 billion in overcharges. So Dr. Jenkins, here's the thought. Was ERCOT actually designed to protect ratepayers?
Well, there's a separate question, I think, is whether the Utility Commission of Texas was, seeing its primary responsibility as to the people of Texas or to the investors in the power system. ERCOT runs the electricity market, but it's regulated by the Utility Commission of Texas, which now has no members, even to figure out how to, navigate after this crisis. So I think it is a shame to see the sort of, vacancy at the commission now at a time when we need regulators to be acting on behalf of the public.
Although it is encouraging to see a bipartisan effort to make sure that the ratepayers are protected now after the fact. Dr. Jenkins, would Texas benefit from a capacity market, the so-called forward markets, where we pay for building capacity, not just for selling electricity?
I think that's an important and open question. I think we have to be a little bit careful about thinking about different financial incentives alone as sufficient to ensure weatherization measures. You have to remember that a lot of the generators that went out during this crisis were hedged, so they were actually obligated to pay back the power that they couldn't generate at the market rate of $9,000 a megawatt hour. So they had an enormous incentive to be available and suffered millions of dollars in losses when they weren't. So I'm not convinced that a capacity market, which would provide different incentives for providing firm capacity, would have fundamentally changed those incentives. The financial incentives were pretty strong. What I think this was is a failure of regulation, honestly, to require certain measures that were cost effective and could provide broad public benefits by avoiding these sorts of crises for the catastrophic impacts on the public writ large that are much larger than the impacts that any individual power plant would face. So we have a public good here to reliability, and I think that ultimately requires regulation to ensure. The benefit of a capacity market is that it gives you one more point of regulation where participation in that capacity market and getting payments, long-term payments for capacity could be contingent on compliance with certain regulations regarding weatherization. And we've seen those kinds of steps taken in other markets like New England, where they require either firm gas contracts or dual fuel capacity for, gas plants that can switch over to oil. So that it would be another point of regulation, but I don't think changing the financial incentives alone would be sufficient.
Would capacity markets have any role in encouraging the diversification of the energy sources?
Not necessarily. Capacity markets don't necessarily lead to greater diversity. In fact, they primarily benefit natural gas power generators in their current design. We have to think carefully about how we design these long-run incentives. They're ostensibly technology neutral, but as Jacob Mays and Dick O'Neill at FERC and others have shown, the specific single contract that they offer is well aligned with the risk profile of gas generators, and other generators face different risks. And so we need a more long-term products to address the different risk profiles that they each face in order to ensure more diversity.
Great. Thank you very much. I yield back.
Ms. Kim is next.
Thank you. Thank you, Ranking Member and Chairwoman Johnson, for holding this hearing today. Unfortunately, my home state of California heavily relies on imported power from other states to help fill electricity demand. According to the Wall Street Journal article from August 2020, California's grid operator must find 10,000 to 15,000 megawatts replacement power during a period where generation of solar and wind power falls off. The combination of wildfires and increased demand due to the COVID-19 pandemic and rising temperatures were a perfect storm, causing power outages in California last summer. And regrettably, as our state looks to purchase more energy from other states and abroad, California plans to shut down the Diablo Canyon power plant at a time when we need a good mix of energy sources. So I'd like to pose the question to all witnesses. Grid scale storage will be a key technology driver for security and resiliency as new energy sources are incorporated into the U.S. power grid. So I'd like to hear from each of you, your perspectives. Are there areas of this research that are better off left to the private industry?
If I could begin, maybe. I think that the history of American innovation around particularly energy technologies is one of active public and private partnership. So the innovation often occurs from private sector businesses, but they're critically supported throughout the entire evolution of that technology by investment on behalf of the public in R&D and demonstration, in early market opportunities in the forms of procurement or tax credits or standards that drive technology. And all of those together help provide the innovative opportunity for the private sector to develop these new technologies. So it's really a partnership, and it's one that America excels at. And it's got us cheap wind and solar power, electric vehicle batteries, LEDs, hydraulic fracturing, and horizontal drilling, all kinds of technologies that are more than paying off the investment that the public has made in those technologies.
Great. Anyone want to chime in too?
Yes, please. Representative Kim, I was raised near you in Redlands, California, and went to school at the Claremont colleges. So I know your district well. And one of the things that complements what Professor Jenkins just said with regard to the important role that the federal government plays in supporting basic science and applied science on storage, among other things, is the kinds of things that have been done in Southern California to have really a demand pull associated with storage technologies and moving those into the markets. So those two things in conjunction with each other are really part of the innovation cycle that can pull resources into the market and lower costs over time. So I think there's a lot to learn from California's experience on this.
Thank you. I would like to thank Dr. Jenkins and Dr. Tierney for your responses. Let me get on to the second question. How does transitioning to the smart grid or adding Internet of Things capabilities to industrial control systems influence security and resiliency in the energy sector? How should we think about incorporating new technologies like artificial intelligence or the Internet of Things in developing more efficient battery storage units?
We really need to set better standards for assuring grid security protocols related to cyber and other issues, because all of those Internet of Things could have the opportunity to create intrusions into the grid's performance. So there's regulatory in the form of standard setting that are uniform around the country, but there's really a tremendous amount of R&D that would be subject to your committee's jurisdiction associated with simulation tools that provide different angles on how there are the interactions between Internet of Things devices and local grid operations. There's a long list of things that I've included in my testimony that would address the kinds of things that you're talking about.
And if I might add, Ms. Kim, very quickly, there is a flip side to it. As we talked about, smart devices, smart meters could have really helped a lot in terms of very smartly cycling non-critical load, which actually was frozen. And so there were large parts of the population without power for several days, as well as in terms of predictive capability. You mentioned artificial intelligence. There's a lot of that could be brought to really get a look ahead. And the final point I want to make is, we do want to separate this event from what can be managed through even grid scale storage. This was an event that lasted for 3 days and, 7 days in many parts. There are very few types of, storage scaled, including very large scale reservoir storage that can be brought, but you can't cite that everywhere. So there are other types of solutions. The scale of this problem is a little bit on the higher side of the spectrum.
Representative Kim, if I could add something really quickly, maybe to bridge between your two questions. It really highlights the importance of government research and government involvement. The industry alone will not have the understanding of the evolving threat and the national security implications of the work that they're doing. They also tend to focus on more near-term research. And so tying back to the universities, tying to the applied and basic research at the national laboratories with the national security in mind, I think is key as we move forward. Thank you.
Thank you. I know my time is up, so I want to thank all the witnesses for your thoughtful responses. Thank you. I yield back.
Ms. Fletcher is next.
Thank you. And thank you to Chairwoman Johnson and Ranking Member Lucas for holding this hearing today. It is incredibly important for those of us in Texas and for the entire country to understand what happened and to craft legislation on this committee to invest in and encourage research and development in grid technology and reliable generation technology. I very much appreciate the witnesses sharing their expertise and their time with us today and in written testimony, which has been so helpful. As one of the members of this committee who lived through the Texas winter storm without power for several days, without water for several more, with a boil water notice for many days after that in my district in Houston, I want to underscore the seriousness of these cascading failures in both the physical markets and the financial markets. Today's hearing is important in making sure that we don't fail to respond in Congress. So many issues have been raised throughout this hearing, and there simply is not time for me to ask all the questions I have in these 5 minutes. So I will submit several questions to the witnesses for the record, and I look forward to your responses. Like Dr. Rai, the temperatures in my own home were in the 40s and I think even the 30s during the event before I found my thermometer. But I was lucky. I had a fireplace and I had warm clothes. But not very far from my house, an 11-year-old boy who had been overjoyed at seeing his first snow on Monday froze to death in his own bed overnight. And he was not the only Texan who froze to death in this storm. Others died from carbon monoxide poisoning trying to keep warm. My constituents who are doctors told me they had never seen anything like the number of people they treated for carbon monoxide poisoning during this time. What we saw in Texas during the winter storm was a catastrophic failure of our electric grid, a catastrophic failure that didn't have to happen. There were ample warnings from both FERC and NERC about how the Texas grid was vulnerable to winter resilience issues that had been documented in detail after the 2011 winter storms. But years of inaction by our state legislature, our governor, and his appointees at the Public Utility Commission left our state with a grid that focused on market profits at the expense of a resilient grid. While affordable energy should be a key priority of our grid system, Texans saw firsthand the catastrophe that occurs when a grid is unable to function and provide life-saving power when people need it the most. My colleague, Mr. Barra, recognizing that Texans have a well-known independent streak, mentioned that Texans perhaps choose to pay less than people in California for their energy. But a recent Wall Street Journal analysis has found that for 2 decades, Texas customers have paid more for electricity than residents of states served by traditional utilities, $28 billion more since 2004. Ms. Garza, given your years of experience at ERCOT, I'm interested in hearing your perspective on Texas's failure to plan for peak demand in the winter. And I won't be able to get to all of my questions, but I do want to focus on this because we haven't talked about it in this hearing. It's my understanding that when ERCOT planned for peak demand that would require distributors to shed load, it was done under the assumption that such an event would occur in the summer when demand is typically highest. When ERCOT ordered distributors to shed load during the storm, the regional allocation for where loads had to be shed was geographically centered around areas where the summer demand would be the highest, particularly in Houston and in South Texas, despite the fact that the north of the state was experiencing higher demand. Is it your understanding that this is the case?
Yes, it is.
And do you agree with me that ERCOT should revisit this planning so that it is able to respond better to winter demand events?
Yes, and I think that it's on the list of things to work on. The only thing I would caution you there is that as you get further south in the state, there is more electric heat, and electric heat uses lots of electricity, the inefficient electric heat that generally exists the further south you go. And so, but factoring that in and understanding a more seasonal distribution of load across the state to more fairly assign those curtailment responsibilities would be an appropriate step, and one that I think is underway.
Well, thank you, Ms. Garza. With my last few seconds, I just want to mention and ask this question. In your written testimony and in your opening comments today, you mentioned that in setting standards, we should have benefits that exceed costs, and noted the infrequency of cold weather in Texas as part of that analysis. With the deaths of at least 70 Texans, the illnesses of many more, with tens of billions of dollars in damages to people's homes and businesses across the state, my question is, whose costs are you referring to in your analysis? And unfortunately, I'm out of time, so I'll take your response in a written response, but I really appreciate all of you being here today. And Madam Chairwoman, I yield back.
Mr. Gonzalez is next.
Thank you, Chairwoman Johnson and Ranking Member Lucas for holding this timely hearing today, and our distinguished witnesses for joining us. One thing I like about the Science Committee is we actually talk about facts, unlike the narratives that you see coming out on social media. In one case, when I flipped on my social media, which I want not to do, folks on the right saw it as the Texas blackouts, which were tragic, as justification for criticisms of wind turbines and renewable energy generally. On the left, those opposed to federalism and free market ideas criticized Texas's deregulated energy market because it incentivizes some companies to prioritize cost over safety. Of course, the answer is both charges are true partially. Power generation companies in Texas took a market risk and chose not to harden their facilities. I think we highlighted that today. And given the high variance of wind and solar, relying on renewables as a primary source of energy increases cost to consumers, can export jobs, and weakens energy independence. What we need is a system that works both ways. Renewable energy serves a purpose when it correctly supplements higher density energy sources. As cheaper, more effective technologies come online, they absolutely should be deployed. And given the threat of uncontrollable weather events, Texas's power generators and utilities should be encouraged to winterize their facilities and toughen the grid against extreme stress. We should also reconsider our approach to nuclear energy, which is a big priority of mine on this committee and across this Congress. While nat gas, coal, and renewable energy capacity plummeted during the blackouts, nuclear remained relatively reliable, operating at 74% of total capacity. I want to start with that fact specifically, and Dr. Jenkins, what is it about nuclear that allowed it to do better relatively? I know it too suffered, but relative to the other energy sources, is there something inherent to the technology, or is it coincidental? Just kind of walk me through what it was about, nuclear that allowed it to be a little bit more resilient through the Texas cyclone.
Yeah, I mean, the main benefit that nuclear enjoys over natural gas in particular is it doesn't need fuel delivery during these kinds of events. And so it's one less vulnerability to supply disruptions on the fuel side of things. Because of the focus on safety and reliability in the nuclear power fleet as well, there are considerable efforts and investments made in maintaining the highest degree of reliability for those plants. And so they also tend to perform better during these sorts of extreme events as well, because they're considerably and justifiably focused on maintaining the highest reliability. I think what the performance of the nuclear fleet also shows is that the diversity of resources helps decorrelate the failures. Right? If you have 10 power plants that all have a 10% chance of failure, but those aren't at all related to each other, the odds of them all failing at once are like 10 to the negative ninth, percent. It's, infinitesimally small. But if they're all linked up to the same natural gas system and that system goes down, or they're all in the same part of the transmission grid and that transmission grid fails, then their outages are correlated. And so I think we have to think carefully about how we diversify the risk exposure. Nuclear has its own risks, but they're different than those for other power sources, and that improves the resilience of our system through diversity.
Thank you. And in your opinion, what do you think the appropriate role for nuclear is when it comes to generation and our goals around reducing our carbon footprint?
Well, I think there's two things to note. The first is that our existing nuclear power fleet is by far the cheapest source of clean, firm generation capacity that we could have. Any new source of carbon-free firm generation is going to be more expensive, with rare exceptions, than maintaining our existing nuclear fleet as long as it is safe to operate. So that's the foundation upon which we can build towards a lower carbon and cleaner energy system. And then in the future, newer nuclear power plants are one of several types of clean, firm generation technologies. At the moment, none are licensed for sale, right? We need to see the NRC process through for the NuScale reactors, for the GE, Hitachi, BWRX, for the others that are moving their way through the process. And when they come to market, we'll be able to see if they can compete with other clean, firm generation technologies like advanced geothermal or alum cycle power plants or natural gas power plants with carbon capture, biomass gasification, hydrogen turbines. There's a whole range of options, and all of those are in a more nascent state today than other technologies. And so I think the race is on, and the efforts that this committee has made in the Energy Act and other legislation to support the development of those technologies will help propel them forward.
So fair to say, in your estimation, nuclear should play an important role in our energy generation future in the United States.
Yeah, I think it already plays an important role today, and it can sustain that role into the future as well, especially if new technologies can be affordably built and on time with little risk, which has been the challenge so far for the nuclear fleet.
Thank you. I hope everyone was listening. I yield back.
Mr. Perlmutter is next.
Thank you very much to our chairwoman and to the ranking member for this panel. You guys are great, and you've got a lot of stamina to answer all these questions for this long. I've got a couple, one for the panel generally, and one of the reasons that I've lasted this long is there's a Coloradan on the panel, and so I want to start with him. Mr. Torres, you've talked about microgrids a lot. Explain to me and to us, how a microgrid, has helped with the California wildfires, how it could help with the wildfires that we face in Colorado from time to time? Let's start with that question. And then I have a general question to the whole panel. You can think about it. We're going to do an infrastructure bill, a big one. That's going to be roads and bridges and waterworks and broadband, but there's going to be an emphasis on the electrical grid. If all of you could think of a couple things you'd like to see us do, either regionally or nationally, to upgrade the grid. So, but I'd like to start with you, Mr. Torres.
Thank you, Representative Perlmutter. So first, maybe understand, we should get on the same page about what I'm referring to as a microgrid. A microgrid is a smaller grid tied to the bigger grid that can disconnect and reconnect as needed. And why would you want to do that? And there are some really good examples with regards to even the recent wildfires in California. Borrego Springs is a microgrid demonstration. We've been working with them for quite a while. They have a lot of issues with transmission lines and the lack of reliability at times for them. So they needed ways to make sure that they could keep the local power up and running. With some local sources, you can use a variety of generation sources, renewable solar, different types of gensets, energy storage, and so on. We're seeing the trend for those kinds of organizations that have a high necessity for very, very reliable power. For example, military installations have been working in this space for a long time. And there was a big demonstration I was involved in about 10 years ago called the Spiders demonstration between the military and the Department of Energy. There are also other resources, or I'm sorry, other loads that really need high reliability power. For example, data centers. They need to increase the amount of reliability because some of the computer systems are very, very sensitive to power. So I believe in the future, we're going to see a lot more owners and operators of various loads that will want to make sure that if there's a loss of a transmission line or loss of centralized generation, that they can still operate through. So I foresee microgrids would be an important element of the future evolving grid.
Thank you. So Dr. Tierney, let's go to you.
Well, thank you. Because I live in Colorado. So you have a second Coloradan on this panel.
Well, let's go to you. And if you want to talk about microgrids or how you think as a general principle, we can upgrade the system. Give me a couple examples.
Well, and I'm going to talk about it in the context of a clean infrastructure recovery package, if that's okay. So I think there could be elements associated with infusing more dollars into building energy efficiency. How boring that sounds, but what a difference that would make if buildings were buttoned up so that houses that were facing either extreme cold or hot events were much more able to withstand those kinds of outside temperatures. Especially doing that in low-income areas, and bundling those two things together will be very important. Second, there is a green bank that is now included, I think it's in the Clean Futures Act. It's the accelerator, Clean Energy Accelerator. It would be a multi-billion dollar infusion of support for local investments that deal both with lowering greenhouse gas emissions with various types of projects, as well as equity considerations. Another third issue is tree planting in urban areas where there are real hotspots. And tree planting in Colorado would not be a bad idea as well, just to restock the forests. Transmission investment we've already talked about. And then finally, in your jurisdictional authority area, all of these investments in R&D for grid resiliency at various stages in the process and to harden the grid and deal with cybersecurity, they're ripe for inclusion in this package. How's that?
Thank you very much. And I want to thank the entire panel. I can't get to all of you, but I want to especially thank the Coloradans.
Mr. Baird is next.
Thank you, Madam Chair and Ranking Member Lucas. I really appreciate your cooperation in bringing us this kind of timely Science Committee meetings, and then to have the talent and capabilities of our witnesses is very much appreciated. I always learn something. We're interested in research and development, and it's a recurring trend, I think, in industry per se across the country, about the need for government and academia as well as private industry to work together, so that we can continue to be successful and be a leader around the world using American technology. So the national labs, I've been impressed with those and the things that they do. And so I think it's important that we focus on the kinds of research that you think are necessary. So I'm going to start with Mr. Rye, Dr. Rye. What do you think is the difference between academia research and private industry research? Are there priorities? Can you help prioritize where you think we need to go, focusing on that research?
Thank you for that question, Mr. Baird. One of the key things with academic research is that it is long range and more basic and fundamental. As we heard earlier in this hearing, that typically the private industry also does a lot of research, but that's really much shorter term, to the range of a year to 5 years, and rarely it is out 10 years out. But a lot of the questions that we are talking about, a lot of the research that can be done really is benefit in the long term. We heard about many computing technologies, about hydraulic fracturing, about storage technologies, wind and solar. These took a long view, a lot of investment over multiple decades, and then supported through demand pull policy, as we heard earlier. And so, there's really this sequencing. There's a lot of interaction, but still there's a sequencing in terms of both the nature of the problems, which are more fundamental, as well as the time horizon that the academic research really differentiates itself. But it has a very fundamental place in terms of generating that diversity of powerful ideas that can then really play out in the private sector over time.
Thank you. Would you agree with the idea that private industry can't really justify just basic research, whereas academia, we invest in that basic research and we still get a return at some point down the road? It may not look like important research at the moment, but down the road, private industry kind of picks that up. Is that, have I got an appropriate analysis of that situation or not?
Absolutely, sir. It has played out again and again in very big ways, in very radical, big ways that change the world forever in multiple settings. So yes, sir.
Congressman, if I could just add to that, the partnership between universities and national laboratories also extends beyond the basic research. There's applied research programs carried out in partnership with industry that continue to provide critical incremental innovations that move these technologies along and make American technology companies, maintain their competitive edge as well. So it extends into that translational and applied research realm also.
And especially because some of this grid resiliency R&D is really a public good, and no private company can really monetize its investment in R&D for such a broad-based thing. We really do need R&D in this area, federally funded.
Yeah, if I could add something as well, I think that partnership across academia where they can focus on longer term research, basic research, higher risk, where industry cannot. They need to have a return, something that's a little bit more certain with lower risk, and the laboratories kind of cover that spectrum. One of the roles that we have here at NREL is providing that bridge, taking the basic and applied research and working with industry, going from, hey, can we prove this in a laboratory, but can this to the next level? Can we actually deploy it? How would it deploy? And can we minimize the risk before it gets deployed in full scale?
Thank you. Ms. Garcia, you got any comments?
So no, short answer is no.
Could I just maybe add that I just strongly encourage the committee to work with your colleagues to ensure appropriations that fulfill the kinds of authorizations included in the Energy Act. You've made an enormous, focus on the kinds of innovative priorities that we have and we've been talking about here. But unless the budget comes through, it's not going to be something that the labs and universities and private sector can tackle.
Well, thank all of you for being here, and I see I'm out of time, so the chair will probably cut me off pretty quick. So, thank you.
Ms. Ross is recognized next.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Madam Chairwoman, for having this important hearing and in such a timely way. I'm from North Carolina, and we are no stranger to odd weather, hurricanes. Today, tornadoes are predicted in my district, and having a resilient energy grid and a modern energy grid is so important to not just delivering the energy every day, but dealing with these severe weather incidents. My first question is to Ms. Garza. In your testimony, you speak about the need for better long-term forecasting of potential conditions. And as I said, North Carolina is no stranger to severe weather, including severe winter weather. As a matter of fact, we in our integrated resource planning, winter peaking has replaced summer peaking because of severe winter weather. I don't know if you knew that about North Carolina, but it was a surprise to a lot of people. We have tropical storms, hurricanes, flooding, and so this can happen year-round. Could you please elaborate on how improved forecasting could help utility companies, state and local authorities, and consumers prepare for extreme weather events like the one that happened in Texas and happens frequently in North Carolina?
Sure. You know, as I've mentioned, the typical pattern has been to just look back at, well, how bad has the weather been? And let's assume that that's as bad as it will be. And with additional population, additional uses, what will my demand for electricity be? And clearly that was insufficient here in Texas. One of the reasons for that look back would be for states like yours in North Carolina that are regulated and have to justify those expenses. It's easy to justify, well, I'm going to build for this because we know it's happened. And unless there's additional input that says, well, the risk is larger than what you've actually occurred, I could see where it would be difficult for utilities that are reliant on rate-based recovery or regulated rates of return to justify additional expenditures. So that's another reason, another justification for outside help, input into the electric utility to make sure that they're adequately planning for the long term, whether it's heat or cold or storms or whatever.
Yeah, and Congressman, this
Can
is...
I add to that, please? Because forecasting and R&D in support of much finer forecasting has this long-term component for demand, and it should take into consideration changes in the climate for sure. But there are short-term operational forecasting issues where integration between wind forecast and local effects, heat forecasts in certain areas, demand forecasts on a couple of days ahead. Those and the forecast of outage probabilities of facilities under different kinds of climate events. Those kinds of things, that's a really important R&D agenda for resilience.
Thank you very much. Yes, sorry, somebody else want to jump in?
Yeah, sorry to interrupt. As I emphasize in my testimony as well, I do think that additional climate science investment that focuses on this question of how these extreme weather events and threats are changing. The probability distribution is moving, and it's those tail events that are the big threats to our system. And so those just get a little bit more likely. That has huge implications for how we plan and prepare our systems. And we need the forward-looking science to be able to help guide us as the climate changes over the next several decades.
Thank you, Dr. Jenkins. My next question is for you. North Carolina is currently #2 in solar in the country. And so we're interested in clean, firm energy. I've represented solar companies, and actually connecting to the grid sometimes is the thing that keeps them from being able to realize their projects. You argue that we don't need every source of electricity to be reliable all the time. We just need the overall system to be reliable. In our last 23 seconds, could you just discuss further how we might be able to do that with an improved grid?
Well, I think the critical need is for technologies that can replace ultimately our natural gas fleet and our retiring coal and eventually nuclear power plants that can provide a similar role as those power plants play today, but without the carbon dioxide emissions and air pollution associated with fossil generation today. So that could be advanced nuclear, natural gas plants with carbon capture and storage, advanced geothermal technologies, that could potentially be very low cost, very long duration energy storage, although those typically are only a partial complement or substitute. And potentially hydrogen production, which could come from renewable sources, could come from biomass, and it could come from natural gas with carbon capture, all of which would provide a zero carbon fuel that could be used in converted natural gas power plants in the longer run. So all of those are options. And I think, again, as I mentioned earlier, the race is on between them to see which will be developed and scalable. And I think we need a diversity of those technologies because what works in North Carolina may not be what works in Texas or in Minnesota or in New England. And so we need a mix of resources that can play that role, the right role in each parts of the country.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I yield back.
Ms. Bonamici is next.
Member Lucas, and thank you to our witnesses for joining us today. I regret I couldn't be in the entire hearing, but I care a lot about this very important topic. And we know that as we transition to a 100% clean energy economy, our electric grid will be a central feature of a comprehensive climate strategy. Our grid needs to be clean, reliable, and importantly, resilient to climate threats. According to a recent report from the University of California, Berkeley, the infrastructure build-out needed to achieve a 90% carbon-free grid would support approximately 530,000 jobs each year and avoid at least $1.2 trillion in cumulative health and environmental damages. Last year, I joined my colleagues on the Select Committee on the Climate Crisis in releasing a bold, comprehensive, science-based climate action plan to reach net zero emissions no later than mid-century and net negative thereafter. Our plan includes many recommendations on grid resilience, including Congressman Vera's bill, which I know we're focusing on today. According to a report from the Government Accountability Office, GAO, released just last week, the climate crisis could affect every aspect of the grid from generation, transmission, and distribution to demand for electricity and cost billions of dollars annually. GAO specifically found that the Department of Energy does not have a strategy, goals, objectives, or performance measures to guide its efforts to enhance the resilience of the grid to the climate crisis. And this is a particular concern to Oregonians in my state because of our raging wildfire seasons and other reasons as well. So Dr. Tierney, how can the DOE best work with federal science agencies to better understand, predict, and respond to grid threats from the climate crisis?
There are dozens of things that the Department of Energy should be doing, and I think there is a groundswell of support for becoming more aggressive on resiliency issues. There was a wonderful program called the Grid Modernization Program that was authorized for 5 years, I think, Juan, is that right? And continuing and deepening that kind of work, supporting work at the labs will be extremely important on these issues. But also, as you say, standard setting for performance is badly needed. It's a tough area when you think about those different levels of the system, generation, transmission, distribution, and demand, but hard work needs to be done there. Thank you for the question.
Thank you. And following up on Representative Ross's question, Dr. Jenkins, I appreciated the reference in your testimony to not needing every source of electricity to be reliable all the time, and instead focusing on the system that requires a mix of electricity resources, all playing the right role on the electricity team. That's how you put it. This is important when we think about equitable access to affordable clean energy. So can you discuss the opportunities to make our transition to a 100% clean energy, reliable, and resistant grid equitable for vulnerable communities who have been on the front lines of the climate crisis?
Well, I think that first I should add, Representative Bonamici, I was born and raised in your district, so it's a pleasure to talk with you. I think that there are huge benefits, potential benefits to a transition to a cleaner energy system for all communities, including those that are currently suffering the most from air pollution from our current fossil energy mix. You referenced the Berkeley Lab study on the 90% reductions in 90% clean by 2035 power system. I'd refer you to the Net Zero America study that we worked at Princeton as well, which estimates very similar benefits for in terms of reduced air pollution, particularly from the phase out of our coal-fired power plants, which Oregon is scheduled to retire its last coal-fired power plant later in a couple of years. And this could result in that and electrification of vehicles, which are the major source of urban air pollution, could substantially reduce exposure to air pollution and save significant lives and costs for households and communities. The other thing we have to think carefully about is where we want to direct investment in the new industries that are growing to deploy clean energy and to manufacture the products there, and to ensure that those are distributed across our country in ways that communities in transition benefit from. I think Oregon knows very keenly the challenges of a large-scale transition. I grew up in the aftermath of the timber wars and the impacts that the phase out of the timber industry had across Oregon communities. And I think we need to make sure that we're proactively investing in economic development and diversification in communities that are currently reliant on fossil generation or fossil fuel production as part of this.
Thank you, Dr. Jenkins. And I'm working on a national transition legislation. So we really do absolutely need to focus on those frontline communities. I also want to mention too, because you are an Oregonian, that we're doing some really exciting work on marine energy off the coast, because unlike the sun and the wind, the waves are constant. So there's a tremendous amount of potential to capture the power of the waves, tides, currents. So
yeah, along with floating offshore wind turbines, which could open up a huge. I mean, the West Coast has the windiest, highest wind potential in the country. If we could cost effectively tap into it.
Well, and of course, working in collaboration with all our coastal partners is tremendous amount of potential. Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I yield back.
Chairwoman Johnson, all the members present have been recognized already. So I think we're ready to close out the hearing.
Thank you very much to all of our tremendous witnesses. We're delighted that you had the time to spend with us, and I'll thank all of our members for participating. Before we bring the hearing to a close, I would just simply like to say to our witnesses to stay close. We might have some questions that you might receive, and we really, really, really appreciate your input. The record will remain open for at least 2 weeks for additional statements from the members or to submit questions for our witnesses. And so now whatever questions that our committee members might ask witnesses. Our witnesses now are excused and our hearing is adjourned.